When Shaquille O'Neal walked into a hospital billing office on Valentine's Day 2024 and saw a mother shaking and crying over a piece of paper, he didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't say a single word. He just reached into his jacket, pulled out a black American Express card, the kind of card you can't even apply for, set it on the counter, and said 3 words, "Put it on this." The bill was $287,000. He paid every penny. Right there, on the spot, like it was nothing. But here's the thing. This wasn't some random act of kindness. This wasn't Shaq just being generous because he heard a woman crying. He was looking for her. He had been looking for her for 6 weeks. And what nobody knew yet, not the mother, not the hospital, not even Shaq himself, was that he had actually been searching for this woman his entire adult life, for 27 years. Since the summer of 1997. Since a bench outside a Boys and Girls Club in Newark, New Jersey, where a 25-year-old Shaq handed cash to a stranger holding a sick baby. That baby grew up. That baby became this mother. And when she looked at Shaq in that billing office and said 5 words that made a 7'1", 325-pound man sit down on the floor and cry, everything changed. What she told him connected a moment from 1997 to a letter written in green crayon by a 7-year-old girl with cancer. A letter addressed to Mr. Shaq O'Neal, the biggest man on the TV basketball show. A letter that asked for nothing for herself. Only 9 words for her mom. 9 words that broke Shaq open, but I haven't told you what those 9 words were yet. I haven't told you what the mother said that put Shaq on the floor. I haven't told you about the woman in the mailroom who almost threw that letter away. And I definitely haven't told you about the bell. The bell at the end of the hallway. The bell that every kid in that hospital dreams about ringing. The bell that means you made it. You're going to want to stay for all of it. Because this story is not what you think it is. It's bigger. It's stranger. It's the kind of story that makes you believe that some things in this world are not accidents. It starts on February 14, 2024, Valentine's Day. But there was nothing romantic about the fluorescent lights buzzing inside the billing department of Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, February 14, 2024, Valentine's Day. But there was nothing romantic about the fluorescent lights buzzing inside the billing department of Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, ranked among the top pediatric hospitals in the entire United States. A place where miracles happen every day and where hearts shatter just as often. Shaquille Rashawn O'Neal, 7 feet, 1 inch tall, 325 pounds of retired dominance, 4-time NBA champion, 15-time All-Star, Basketball Hall of Famer since 2016, and Dr. O'Neal because yes, this man earned his Ed.D. in Human Resource Development from Barry University in Miami on May 5, 2012. Was not supposed to be here this morning. He was in Atlanta for his regular gig. TNT's Inside the NBA, the Emmy-winning studio show he's co-hosted since 2011 alongside Charles Barkley, Kenny the Jet Smith, and Ernie Johnson Jr. out of Studio J on the old Techwood campus near Centennial Olympic Park. He had a production meeting at noon. Tonight's broadcast would cover a packed slate of games. It was the middle of the season, All-Star Weekend was approaching, and the crew needed to prep segments. The plan for the morning had been simple, sacred even. Breakfast at the Waffle House on Ponce de Leon Avenue, scattered, smothered, covered, chunked, the works. Because Shaquille O'Neal loves Waffle House the way most people love breathing. It is not a preference, it is a biological requirement. Then back to the studio, then work, then home. Simple plan. But plans are just stories we tell ourselves about a future that hasn't agreed to cooperate. The plan changed because of a sound. A sound he heard through a door he was never supposed to walk through. In a hallway he had no reason to be standing in, inside a hospital where he had no appointment, no meeting, no scheduled appearance. The sound was a mother crying. Not the polite kind, not the dabbing eyes with a tissue kind. Not the kind you do at weddings or during the last 10 minutes of a sad movie when the music swells and you know it's safe to feel, because the credits are coming. This was something else entirely. This was raw, guttural. It came from somewhere below the lungs, below the stomach, from whatever place inside a human being holds the things we cannot survive losing. It was the sound of something breaking that was never engineered to break. A load-bearing wall inside a person's soul giving way. Shaq stopped mid-stride. His security, Demetrius, a former Marine who'd been on his detail for 6 years and had learned to read Shaq's body language the way sailors read weather, nearly collided with his back. "Hold up," Shaq said. Quiet, almost a whisper. He turned toward the sound. There was a door to his left. Small rectangular window cut into the upper half. He looked through it. Inside, a billing office. Gray walls. A fake plant in the corner that was trying its best. A laminated poster about payment plan options that nobody in the history of financial ruin had ever been comforted by. And a woman. She was small, 5'2" at most. She was wearing green hospital scrubs, but they were wrinkled in a way that said she hadn't changed them in at least a day, maybe 2. Not because she was careless, because she hadn't gone home. Her dark hair was pulled back into a bun that was slowly surrendering to gravity, loose strands framing a face that looked 10 years older than it probably was. Exhaustion does that. Fear does it faster. Her hands were trembling as she held a single sheet of paper. Even through the door, even from 6 feet away, even with his eyes that needed corrective lenses he sometimes forgot to wear, Shaq could see what that paper was. A billing statement. The numbers were printed in that cold, indifferent font that hospitals use. The font designed to be clear and readable, which really means designed to make astronomical figures look clinical instead of catastrophic. As if formatting could soften the blow of a number that just ended your life as you knew it. Across the desk from her sat a hospital billing administrator. A man in a blue button-down shirt with a lanyard around his neck, speaking in that measured, practiced, impossibly calm voice that people in his position are trained to use. The voice that says, "I understand this is difficult," without ever acknowledging that difficult is the understatement of the century. The voice that walks you through options when there are no options. The voice that explains interest rates and payment timelines while your child is 3 floors above you connected to tubes. Shaq couldn't hear every word through the glass, but he heard enough. He heard numbers. Big numbers. He heard the woman's breathing hitch. That terrible, involuntary inhale that happens when a person is trying to hold themselves together and their body refuses to cooperate. He didn't think about what he did next. Later, when people asked him to explain the moment, he would say, "I didn't decide. My body just moved." It was like a rebound. You don't think about a rebound, you just go get it. And then he'd pause and his face would change, and he'd add, "But this was more important than any rebound I ever got." He opened the door. He didn't knock. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't excuse himself. He didn't say sorry to interrupt. He didn't flash a smile or extend a hand or do any of the things that famous people do when they enter rooms. The performance of arrival. The choreography of celebrity. He just walked in. The billing administrator looked up, then looked up some more, then looked up even further, because making eye contact with Shaquille O'Neal is a multi-stage process that requires significant cervical adjustment. By the time the administrator's neck had completed its full upward journey, and his eyes had reached Shaq's face, his mouth was already slightly open. The woman didn't turn around. She was still staring at the paper, still shaking. Shaq reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, custom-tailored Tom Ford, because when you are Shaq's size, nothing comes off the rack. Every piece of clothing is a negotiation between fabric and physics, and pulled out a card. Not a business card, a black American Express Centurion card, the card you don't apply for, the card that invites you, the card that has no preset spending limit, not because the limit is high, but because the concept of a limit does not apply. The card that reportedly requires a minimum annual spend of $250,000 just to maintain. The card that, in the world of personal finance, is less a payment method and more a statement of economic reality. It says, whatever the number is fine. Shaq placed it on the counter. The soft click of hard plastic meeting laminate desk was the loudest sound in the room. "Put it on this," he said. 3 words, not a question, not an offer, not a negotiation, a decision already made, already final. 3 words delivered with the same quiet certainty. with which he once told Pat Riley he was leaving Orlando, with which he told Phil Jackson he was ready for Game 7, with which he told his mother, Lucille, that he was going to make it, and meant it in a way that rearranged the future. Put it on this. The administrator stared at the card, then at Shaq, then at the card again. His mouth opened and closed twice without producing language, like a man whose brain was buffering. The woman finally turned around. Her eyes were red, so swollen that the whites had gone pink, so exhausted that the irises seemed to be floating in something heavier than tears. She looked up at Shaq, and the look on her face wasn't recognition, it wasn't awe. It wasn't even gratitude, not yet. Gratitude requires comprehension, and comprehension hadn't arrived. She was looking at him the way a drowning person looks at a hand extended over the water, not understanding it, just reaching for it. She didn't recognize him, not as Shaquille O'Neal, not as the man on television, not as the NBA legend. Because when your 7-year-old daughter is upstairs in a hospital bed with a port in her chest and poison dripping into her veins to save her life, and you are sitting in a plastic chair being told that you owe more money than you will make in the next 4 years, you do not care about fame. You do not care about celebrity. You do not care if the President of the United States walks through that door. You care about one thing, and one thing only, your child. Shaq saw it in her eyes, that single-focused desperation, that tunnel vision of a parent whose entire universe has contracted to the size of one small body in one hospital bed. He knew that look. He'd seen it before, 27 years before, on a bench outside a Boys and Girls Club in Newark, New Jersey, on the face of a woman holding a baby with yellow skin. But here's the part of this story that nobody talks about. Here's the part that changes everything. The part that transforms this from a generous moment into something that defies every law of probability, every notion of coincidence, every comfortable boundary between what we call random and what we call meant to be. The reason Shaquille O'Neal was at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta that morning was not because he wandered in off the street. It was not a detour. It was not a spontaneous act of kindness triggered by a sound through a door. He was there on purpose. He was looking for someone he'd been trying to find for 27 years. And the woman in the green scrubs, the one with the shaking hands and the shattered eyes and the bill that was burying her alive, was the answer to a question he'd been carrying since the summer of 1997. He just didn't know it yet. Neither did she. Her name was Maribel Constantino Reyes. Say it slowly. Let it sit in your mouth. Maribel Constantino Reyes. 4 syllables of first name, 5 of mother's surname, 2 of father's. Every syllable earned. Every letter carrying the weight of a story that stretches across oceans, across decades, across the kind of distance that doesn't show up on maps, because it's measured in sacrifice, not miles. She was 39 years old. Born on August 3, 1984, in Cebu City, Philippines, the Queen City of the South, a dense, humid, beautiful sprawl of 7 million people pressed between green mountains and blue water on the island of Cebu in the central Visayas. If you've never been to Cebu City, imagine a place where the air smells like diesel and jasmine at the same time, where jeepneys, those wildly painted extended jeeps that function as public buses, barrel through streets so narrow that pedestrians flatten themselves against walls to let them pass, and where Catholic churches built by Spanish colonizers 400 years ago stand next to 21st century call centers, where young Filipinos work overnight shifts, answering customer service calls for American companies in accents so perfectly neutralized that the callers in Ohio and Texas never realize they're speaking to someone 7,000 miles away. That was the world Maribel came from. But it wasn't the world she stayed in. In 2009, 1 year after the global financial crisis gutted the American economy and paradoxically created a desperate shortage of healthcare workers as hospitals hemorrhaged staff through layoffs, early retirements, and burnout, Maribel Constantino Reyes arrived at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport on a nursing visa. She was 24 years old. She had a Bachelor of Science in Nursing from Cebu Doctors University. She had $600 in her checking account. She had a rolling suitcase with a broken wheel. And she had a promise she'd made to her mother, Lucinda, who was standing at Mactan Cebu International Airport on the other side of the world, watching her daughter disappear through a security checkpoint. "I will make it worth it, Nane. I will make you proud, Nane." The Cebuano word for mother, soft when whispered, heavy when it carries a promise. Maribel didn't just make it. She ground herself into the machinery of the American healthcare system and came out the other side as something forged rather than broken, which is not a guarantee. For every Filipino nurse who builds a career in the States, there are stories of others who were exploited, underpaid, isolated, trapped in contracts with staffing agencies that treated them like inventory rather than people. The Filipino nurse pipeline, and it is a pipeline. The Philippines is the single largest exporter of nurses in the world, with over 200,000 Filipino nurses working in the United States alone, is built on the labor of women and men who leave everything behind on the promise of something better. Maribel found something better. But better does not mean easy. Her first job was at Tampa General Hospital in Florida, night shift, 12 hours, 11 p.m. to 11 a.m., the medical surgical unit. The floor that gets everything: post-operative patients, diabetic crises, heart failure, infections that don't respond to antibiotics, patients who scream, patients who cry, patients who are so quiet that the silence is worse than screaming. She lasted 2 years in Tampa, not because she couldn't handle it. She could handle anything. Lucinda had raised her to be a woman who bent but never broke, but because the staffing agency that had sponsored her visa placed her in Atlanta next. Grady Memorial Hospital, the largest hospital in the state of Georgia, a Level I trauma center, the kind of place where gunshot victims and car accident survivors and homeless patients with untreated diseases all converge under one roof. And the nurses hold the entire thing together with competence, caffeine, and a refusal to sit down. Maribel worked at Grady for 3 years. She earned her stripes. She earned her reputation. She earned the respect of physicians who initially looked past her because she was small and quiet and had an accent. An accent that faded over time but never fully disappeared. Because accents are not flaws to be corrected. They are maps of where you've been. And then, in 2015, she transferred to Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, pediatrics. Specifically, the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit, the PICU, the place where the smallest patients fight the biggest battles, where a 4-pound premature baby is connected to more technology than a space shuttle, where parents stand at bedsides looking like refugees from their own lives, displaced, disoriented, clinging to whatever the doctor said last as if words alone could keep their child alive. Maribel chose pediatrics deliberately. She chose it because of something Lucinda had told her years ago. A story that Maribel carried in her chest like a second heartbeat. The story of the giant. Lucinda had told it only once, on the night before Maribel left for America. They were sitting on the floor of their small apartment in Cebu City, eating rice and tinola, a ginger soup with chicken and green papaya, and Lucinda was trying not to cry because she was about to watch her only daughter leave for a country she herself had once lived in briefly and barely survived. "When you were a baby," Lucinda said, "you were very sick. Your liver was not working. I didn't have money. I didn't have insurance. I didn't have anyone." Maribel had heard fragments of this before, references to a surgery, to a hard time in America, but never the full story. Never with this level of detail. Lucinda had always deflected, changed the subject, said that was before, as if before was a country she'd left and didn't want to revisit. But tonight was different. Tonight was the last night. "I was sitting on a bench," Lucinda continued, "outside a building where children played. In New Jersey, in the summer. It was very hot. You were in my arms, and you were barely moving, and I didn't know what to do. I was praying. Not to God, I was angry at God that day. I was praying to the air. She paused, stirred the tinola, didn't look up, and a giant came. That's what she called him. Not a man, not a stranger, a giant. As if he were from a fairy tale. As if he had walked out of one of the stories Lucinda used to tell Maribel at bedtime. The stories about the Capra, the tree giant of Filipino folklore who sits in the branches of old balate trees and smokes enormous cigars. He was the tallest person I had ever seen. He asked me what was wrong. I told him, and he helped. He gave me money. He gave me a number to call. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't tell me his name. He just helped, and then he walked away. Lucinda finally looked up. Her eyes were wet but steady. That giant saved your life, Anak. You had the surgery. Your liver healed. You lived. Everything after that, everything, is because a stranger decided to stop. Anak. Cebuano for my child, a word that contains an entire universe. Maribel asked the question that anyone would ask, who was he? Lucinda shook her head. I don't know. I never saw him again. But I know what he taught me. What? That the world is full of people who walk past. But it only takes one who stops. That story was the reason Maribel became a nurse, not the visa, not the money, not the career stability. The story of the giant who stopped. She wanted to be someone who stopped. She wanted to be, for other people's children, what an unnamed stranger had been for her. The difference between a life that ends and a life that begins. For 9 years at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, she was exactly that. 9 years of 12-hour shifts. 9 years of alarms and vitals and medication schedules, and parents who looked at her with eyes that begged her to promise something she couldn't promise. 9 years of holding children who were not hers and loving them as if they were, because that is what pediatric nurses do. They expand their hearts past the point of structural integrity and somehow keep functioning. Maribel was not someone who asked for help. She was the help. But 6 months before that Valentine's Day morning, everything collapsed. It started with a bruise. Isadora, her daughter, 7 years old, born September 12, 2016, at Northside Hospital in Atlanta, 6 pounds 11 ounces, a baby who came out screaming so loud that the delivery nurse said, well, she has opinions, had a bruise on her left shin that wouldn't go away. Maribel noticed it in August 2023. It was purple, then green, then purple again. It didn't follow the normal chromatic progression of a healing bruise. It just stayed. Then another one appeared, on her right arm, then her back. Maribel was a nurse. She knew what unexplained bruising in a child could mean. She knew the differential diagnosis. She knew the blood work that would need to be ordered. She knew all of it intellectually, clinically, professionally. But knowing something as a nurse and knowing it as a mother are two entirely different forms of knowledge. One lives in your brain. The other lives in the part of you that stops breathing. The blood work came back on September 4, 2023. Priya Nagarajan, Isa's assigned oncologist at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, a 44-year-old graduate of Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, who had treated over 800 pediatric cancer patients in her career, and who still, after all those years, had not developed the emotional callus that some oncologists grow to protect themselves. Sat Maribel down in a consultation room with lavender walls and a box of tissues that was already half empty from the family before. Acute lymphoblastic leukemia, all the most common cancer in children. Approximately 3,000 new cases per year in the United States. 5-year survival rate, around 90%. Those are good numbers. Those are hopeful numbers. But numbers are abstractions. Numbers are what you cite when you're standing at a podium giving a presentation at a medical conference. Numbers are not what you hear when the doctor across from you says the word leukemia and the word your daughter in the same sentence, and the lavender walls start to tilt, and the floor becomes unreliable, and the tissues in the half-empty box blur into white shapes, because your eyes have filled with a kind of water that has nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with terror. Maribel didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She didn't do any of the things that movies show mothers doing when they receive catastrophic news. She asked 3 questions. What is the treatment protocol? What is the timeline? When do we start? Dr. Nagarajan answered all 3. Chemotherapy. 18 to 24 months. Immediately. Maribel nodded, stood up, walked to the bathroom, locked the door, and then she broke, silently, completely. The way a building demolishes, not from the outside, but from within. The charges go off deep inside the structure, and for a moment the building stands there, looking exactly the same, and then it falls straight down into itself, into the space where it used to be. She rebuilt herself in that bathroom, splashed water on her face, tightened her bun, walked back out, smiled at Isa, who was in the waiting room coloring a picture of a cat that looked more like a potato with whiskers. "What did the doctor say, Mommy?" "She said you're going to be just fine, baby." "Okay. Can we get McDonald's?" "Yes. We can get McDonald's." They got McDonald's. Isa had chicken nuggets, 10-piece with sweet and sour sauce, no exceptions, every time. Maribel had nothing. She sat across from her daughter in a plastic booth and watched her eat and memorized every detail of her face. The way her nose crinkled when she laughed, the gap where her front tooth used to be, the dark eyes that were so much like Lucinda's that sometimes looking at Isa felt like looking backward through time. Maribel memorized these things because she was afraid, because the 90% survival rate meant a 10% chance that she would lose everything that mattered. And 10%, when it's your child, feels like 100. The treatment began the following week. Chemotherapy, port placement, blood draws, anti-nausea medications that didn't fully work, which meant nights, long, airless, fluorescent nights, spent holding Isa's hair back as she vomited into a plastic basin, and then, after the hair started falling out in clumps, holding her bare head instead, palm against warm scalp, whispering, "You're okay. You're okay." Mommy's here in a voice steady enough to believe if you didn't listen too closely. Maribel took a leave of absence from work. She had to. You cannot work 12-hour ICU shifts when your daughter needs you 24 hours a day. FMLA, the Family and Medical Leave Act, gave her 12 weeks of job-protected leave but unpaid. 12 weeks without a paycheck. The bills didn't take 12 weeks off. Rent? $1,400 a month. The apartment on Jonesboro Road, 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. A kitchen window that looked out onto a parking lot where someone's car alarm went off every night at 2 a.m. Utilities, $180 a month. Car payment, $320 a month. She'd financed a used 2019 Honda Accord 2 years earlier, and the interest rate, because her credit score was good but not perfect, was 6.9%. Insurance premiums, $340 a month, even with the hospital's group rate. Food, gas. Isa's medications, the ones insurance didn't cover, the anti-nausea pills and the supplements and the special nutritional shakes that Dr. Nagarajan recommended because chemo patients need calories their bodies don't want. Those alone ran $400 to $600 a month. The money went out. The money didn't come in. The math was impossible, the kind of arithmetic that doesn't end in a number, it ends in a wall. Maribel sold the Honda Accord, got $11,000 for it, less than she owed, so she ate the remaining $3,200 on the loan. She bought a 2006 Honda Civic from a listing on Facebook Marketplace for $3,400 cash. It had 187,000 miles. The air conditioning worked intermittently. The check engine light was on. She named it Lola, grandmother in Filipino, because it was old and stubborn and refused to die. She borrowed $15,000 from her sister Felicidad back in Cebu. Felicidad, whose name literally means happiness, which was either beautiful or cruel depending on the day, had saved that money over 11 years working the night shift at a BPO call center in Cebu IT Park, answering billing disputes for an American telecommunications company. 11 years of saying, "I understand your frustration, sir," to strangers in Indiana and Michigan, saving 3,000 pesos here, 5,000 pesos there, building a nest egg for her own future. She wired it all to Maribel without hesitation, without conditions, without even a pause. Because that's what sisters do. They hand you 11 years and say, "Pay me back whenever." It doesn't matter. Maribel applied for every assistance program she could find. Care Credit, a healthcare credit card with a promotional 0% APR that would eventually skyrocket to 26.99% if she didn't pay it off in time. Hospital financial aid, which required paperwork that made tax returns look like Post-it notes. A GoFundMe page that her co-worker, a nurse named Rhonda, set up without asking, titling it "Help Isa Fight" and sharing it on Facebook. The GoFundMe raised $400 in 3 weeks. Most of it came from fellow nurses at Children's Healthcare. A few hundred came from members of St. Philip Benizi Catholic Church in Jonesboro, Georgia, where Maribel attended Sunday Mass when she wasn't working, which, for the past several years, had been almost never. $4,200. Kind money, generous money. Real money that represented real sacrifice from people who didn't have much themselves. But the bill was $287,000. $287,000. The number included 6 months of chemotherapy infusions, port placement surgery, 3 emergency room visits when Isa's white blood cell count crashed, and she spiked fevers that sent Maribel racing through red lights at 3 a.m. in the Civic with the broken air conditioning. It included the experimental component of the treatment protocol, a targeted therapy that Dr. Nagarajan believed, based on recent clinical data from St. Jude Children's Research Hospital, gave Isa a significantly better long-term prognosis. Insurance classified it as investigational. Investigational, in insurance language, means we acknowledge this might save your daughter's life, but we've decided not to pay for it. $287,000. For a single mother making $72,000 a year, a salary that in most contexts represents a solid middle-class life. A salary that, in the context of a $287,000 medical bill, represents a rowboat in the middle of the Atlantic. That number was not a bill. It was a burial. And on the morning of February 14, 2024, sitting in a plastic chair in the billing office of the hospital where she had spent 9 years caring for other people's children, holding a piece of paper that contained that number printed in that cold, indifferent font, Maribel Constantino Reyes was watching the billing administrator explain payment plan options. 60 months, 48 months, lump sum discount, hardship application, financial counselor referral. Words. Just words. Words that sounded like rope being offered to a woman who was already underwater. Technically useful, practically meaningless. That's when the door opened without a knock. That's when the air in the room shifted. The way air shifts when something very large displaces it. That's when the giant walked in. But here's what Maribel didn't know, what she wouldn't learn until later that morning, in a moment that would take the ground out from under her for the second time in an hour. But this time the falling would feel like flying. Shaq didn't find her by accident. He didn't wander into that hallway. He didn't hear the crying and impulsively decide to be generous. He found her because of Isa. Because 6 weeks earlier, a 7-year-old girl with leukemia and a crayon had written a letter to the biggest man on the TV basketball show, and the letter had found its way to exactly the right hands. 6 weeks before Valentine's Day, January 10, 2024, the first working day of the new year, a Wednesday. Atlanta was cold, not Midwest cold, not the kind of cold that makes your bones feel like they're made of glass, but Georgia cold, which is a damp, gray, sneaky kind of cold that gets inside your jacket and sets up camp in your shoulders and doesn't leave until April. At Turner Studios on Techwood Drive, the sprawling broadcast complex that has served as the home of TNT, TBS, and CNN since Ted Turner built his cable empire in the 1980s, the holiday break was over. Crews were returning. Producers were scheduling. The machinery of live television was grinding back to life after 2 weeks of reruns and skeleton staffing. And in the mailroom on the first floor, a woman named Carolyn Benford was sorting the mail. This is an important moment. Pay attention, because the entire trajectory of this story, the $287,000, the black card, the billing office, all of it pivots on what happened next. And what happened next was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was the quietest kind of miracle. A 61-year-old woman reading a piece of mail and making a decision. Carolyn Benford had worked in the TNT mailroom for 14 years. She started in 2010, back when the mail volume was heavier, before email replaced most business correspondence, before FedEx and UPS took the urgent packages, before the physical mailroom became a relic of an earlier era of communication. But the fan mail still came, especially for the inside the NBA guys, especially for Shaq. Shaquille O'Neal received, on average, between 200 and 400 pieces of physical mail per week. Letters, packages, gifts, autograph requests, business proposals printed on expensive paper by people who thought expensive paper would make a difference. Marriage proposals, more than you'd expect. Prayer requests, more than anyone would expect. Drawings from children. Drawings from adults who drew like children. Invitations to events, openings, fundraisers, charity galas, birthday parties, bar mitzvahs, quinceañeras, and at least one goat-naming ceremony in rural Tennessee. Carolyn sorted all of it. Every piece, she had a system. Business correspondence went into a gray bin. Jerome Crawford, Shaq's personal assistant, collected it every Tuesday and Friday. Legal documents went into a locked drawer. Fan mail went into a blue bin, which was processed by a small team that sent back signed photos and form letters through the Shaquille O'Neal Foundation. Gifts went into a separate area where they were logged and, depending on content, either forwarded to Shaq or donated to local charities. The system was efficient. Impersonal by necessity, you can't personally respond to 20,000 letters a year, but efficient. On the morning of January 2nd, 2024, Carolyn was working through a backlog. The mail had piled up during the holiday break. She had 2 rolling carts full of envelopes and packages, and she was moving through them with the practiced speed of someone who had sorted roughly 400,000 pieces of mail in her career, and could categorize a letter by its envelope alone. The weight of the paper, the handwriting, the return address, the stamp choice, in under 3 seconds. She almost missed it. The envelope was small, standard letter size, white, slightly crumpled at one corner, as if it had been jostled during transit. The stamp, a forever stamp featuring an American flag, was placed upside down in the upper right corner, the way someone would place it if they were still learning how stamps worked. Still learning how a lot of things worked. Still 7. The address was written in crayon, green crayon. The handwriting was large, wobbly, and confident in the way that only a child's handwriting can be. Each letter formed with intense concentration and absolute disregard for the ruled lines of the envelope. M.R. Shaq O'Neal, the biggest man on the TV basketball show The TNT Building, Atlanta, Georgia, no zip code, no street address. The fact that this letter arrived at all was a small testament to the competence of the United States Postal Service, and the reasonable assumption that there was only one TNT building in Atlanta, and only one person who could be described as the biggest man on the TV basketball show. Carolyn looked at the return address, Jonesboro Road, South Atlanta, written in the same green crayon, in the same wobbly hand, ISA C. APT4B. She started to place it in the blue bin. Fan mail, standard processing, signed photo, form letter, done. But she stopped. It was the crayon. Something about the crayon, the earnestness of it. The way the letters were pressed so hard into the envelope that the crayon had left a waxy texture you could feel with your fingertips, the way Braille can be felt. As if the words had been not just written but physically pushed into existence by small hands that understood, on some level, that this letter mattered more than any letter they had ever written or would ever write. Carolyn opened it. She wasn't supposed to. Protocol was to sort unopened, let the fan mail team handle content. But 14 years in a mailroom gives you a certain authority, the authority of tenure, of institutional knowledge, of being the person who has been here longer than most of the executives upstairs and will be here after they've moved on to their next job. Carolyn exercised that authority now. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper, lined notebook paper, the kind with the wide ruling that elementary schools use. The letter was written in the same green crayon, except for the drawing at the bottom, which used multiple colors. Brown for the skin, black for the shorts, orange for the basketball, and a disproportionate amount of yellow for what appeared to be either a crown or an explosion happening above the figure's head. The drawing depicted a very tall stick figure dunking a basketball. The stick figure was approximately 4 times taller than the basketball hoop, which was either an artistic choice or an accurate representation of how Shaquille O'Neal appears to a 7-year-old. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Shaq, my name is Issa. I am 7. I am sick, but I am going to be okay because my mom says so, and my mom never lies. My mom is a nurse, and she helps kids at the hospital. She is the best mom in the whole world. She cries at night when she thinks I am sleeping, but I am not sleeping. I am listening. She cries because of money. Can you help my mom not cry anymore? I don't want anything for me. I have my blanket and my cat Domingo, so I am fine. But my mom needs help, And she won't ask because she says Constantinos don't ask people for things, we earn them. But I am asking because I am 7, and the rules are different when you are 7. Thank you, Mr. Shaq. P.S. You are very, very, very tall. How do you fit in your car? Love, Isa. Carolyn read it once. Then she sat down. Slowly, the way people sit down when their legs have made a decision that their brain hasn't caught up to yet. And she read it again. She cries at night when she thinks I am sleeping, but I am not sleeping, I am listening. That line, that single line. 20 words written in green crayon by a 7-year-old who was supposed to be asleep but wasn't, who was lying in her bed in a dark room in a small apartment on Jonesboro Road, listening to her mother sob on the other side of a thin wall. The kind of wall that exists in affordable apartments. Walls that are really just suggestions. Walls that separate rooms without separating sounds, without separating pain, and who processed that sound not as a child processes things, with confusion and fear, but with a clarity that was almost unbearable. My mom cries because of money. Not because she's sick, not because she's scared. Because of money. A 7-year-old had identified the problem. Had stripped away all the medical terminology, all the insurance jargon, all the bureaucratic complexity, and had arrived at the irreducible truth. Her mother was drowning, and the water was made of dollars. And then, and this is the part that breaks you, the part that broke Carolyn Benford at her sorting desk on a cold Wednesday morning in January. Isa had done something about it. Not for herself. She had her blanket, she had her cat Domingo, she was fine, for her mom. Can you help my mom not cry anymore? 9 words. A complete thesis. A prayer disguised as a question, sent to the only person Isa could think of who might be big enough to carry the weight her mother could no longer hold. And then the justification. The legal argument presented with the ironclad logic of a 2nd grader, but I am asking because I am 7, and the rules are different when you are 7. The rules are different when you are 7. She was right. The rules are different when you are 7. When you are 7, you are still operating under the original terms of the human contract. The one that says if someone is hurting, you help them. The one that says if someone is crying, you make it stop. The one that adults spend their entire lives unlearning, because the world teaches you that helping is complicated, that generosity has consequences, that you should mind your own business, that systems exist for a reason, that you can't just write a letter in green crayon to a giant on television and ask him to fix your mother's life. But Isa hadn't learned any of that yet. She was 7, and the rules were different. Carolyn Benford sat at her desk and held that letter, and something happened inside her chest that she would later describe to her daughter, Vanessa, as a fist closing around my heart, not in a painful way, but in a holding way. Like someone was holding my heart so it wouldn't fall. Because Carolyn had a granddaughter. Her name was Amira. She was 8 years old. She had braids that Carolyn did herself every 2 weeks. A ritual, a sacrament. 2 hours of pulling and parting and plaiting while Amira sat between Carolyn's knees on the living room floor and watched cartoons and complained about the pulling and was told to sit still and didn't sit still because 8-year-olds are constitutionally incapable of sitting still. The year before, 2023. Amira had been treated for Wilms tumor, a kidney cancer that primarily affects children, usually between the ages of 3 and 4, but sometimes later. Amira was diagnosed at 7. She had surgery at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, the same hospital where Isa was being treated. She had her left kidney removed. She had 12 weeks of chemotherapy. She lost her hair. She lost 15 pounds from a frame that didn't have 15 pounds to spare. She survived. She was in remission. Her braids grew back, but Carolyn remembered. Carolyn remembered what those months were like. Not for Amira, who was a child and therefore experienced her cancer with the strange, brutal adaptability that children bring to everything, but for the family. For Vanessa, Carolyn's daughter, who was Amira's mother. For the bills that arrived like bombs in the mailbox. For the insurance company's letters that used the word "need" the way a judge uses a gavel, with finality and without apology. For the nights that Vanessa spent at Carolyn's kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of papers and an expression on her face that Carolyn recognized from Isa's letter. the expression of a mother who cries when she thinks nobody is listening. Carolyn did not put the letter in the blue bin. She stood up, pushed her chair back, walked out of the mailroom, took the elevator to the third floor, walked past 2 security checkpoints, waved through both, because everyone knew Carolyn, everyone had known Carolyn for 14 years. She was as much a part of this building as the elevators themselves. She walked directly to the office of Jerome Crawford. Jerome was 36 years old. He had been Shaq's personal assistant for 4 years, which in celebrity PA time is roughly equivalent to 40 years in any other profession. The job required the organizational skills of a military logistics officer, the discretion of a Swiss banker, the patience of a Buddhist monk, and the ability to source a size 22 shoe at 11 p.m. on a Sunday. Jerome had all of these qualities plus one more. He was genuinely kind, not performatively kind. Not kind because it's good for the brand kind. Kind in the way that manifests as actually reading the letters that people send, actually listening to the voicemails that people leave, actually caring that behind every piece of fan mail is a real person who sat down and spent time and postage on the hope that someone would hear them. Carolyn walked into Jerome's office without knocking. This was unusual. Carolyn was a knocker. Carolyn believed in knocking the way the Vatican believes in saints, as a fundamental tenet of civilized existence. She didn't knock this time. She placed the letter on Jerome's desk. "Read this," she said. Jerome looked at her face. Whatever he saw there, something in her eyes, something in the set of her jaw, something that communicated urgency without raising her voice, made him pick up the letter immediately. He read it. Then he read it again. "Where did this come from?" he asked. "The mail this morning. It's been sitting in the holiday backlog." Jerome looked at the envelope, the green crayon, the upside-down stamp, the address that included no zip code and no street number, but somehow, impossibly, correctly reached its destination. "I'm taking this to him," Jerome said. "Right now," Carolyn said. It was not a suggestion. Jerome walked to Shaq's dressing room. It was 11:15 a.m., The studio was in pre-production mode. Crews were setting up lights. Producers were reviewing rundowns. Inside the NBA set, the curved desk with the 4 chairs, the screens behind them, the monitors everywhere, was being prepped for that evening's broadcast. Shaq was in his dressing room. He was eating. Of course he was eating. He was eating a foot-long meatball sub from Subway, marinara, provolone, toasted with jalapenos, on Italian herbs and cheese bread. This was not an occasional choice. This was a ritual. Shaq ate a meatball sub from Subway before nearly every taping. The same order, the same bread, the same toppings, consistency, routine. The kind of pregame preparation that had structured his entire athletic career now applied to the consumption of fast food sandwiches. Jerome stood in the doorway. "What?" Shaq said, mouth full. "You need to read something." Jerome handed him the letter. Shaq took it with one hand. His hand was so large that the notebook paper looked like a post-it note in his grip, and read it while chewing. He stopped chewing halfway through. "By the time he reached, she cries at night when she thinks I am sleeping. But I am not sleeping. I am listening." The meatball sub was resting on the wrapper on his lap, forgotten. Marinara sauce was cooling. Provolone was congealing. The jalapenos were going to waste. Anyone who knows Shaquille O'Neal truly knows him. Not the television personality, not the brand ambassador, not the pitchman for Icy Hot and the General and Papa John's, but the actual man, knows that there are approximately 3 things on planet Earth that can make Shaq put down a meatball sub mid-bite: his children being in danger, his mother Lucille calling, and a child in pain. That's the list. That's the complete list. Shaq read the letter a second time. He turned it over, as if hoping there was more. There wasn't. Just the drawing, the impossibly tall stick figure, the orange basketball, the yellow explosion crown. He looked at Jerome. "Find her," he said, 2 words, quiet. No elaboration. No questions about logistics or legality or scheduling. No hesitation. No let me think about it. No run it by the team. No what's the angle here. Find her. The same economy of language he would use 6 weeks later in a billing office. Put it on this, the same instinct. The same compression of feeling into the fewest possible syllables. as if the words were so heavy that each one cost something to lift. Jerome nodded, took the letter back, started walking toward the door. Jerome, he turned, don't tell anyone. Not PR, not the foundation. Nobody. This isn't content, understood. Jerome left. Shaq sat in his dressing room for a long time. The meatball sub went cold. He didn't eat it. Later that night, on air, during a segment about the Western Conference standings, Charles Barkley made a joke about Shaq being unusually quiet. You feel okay, big man? You look like somebody stole your lunch. Shaq smiled, but it was the wrong kind of smile. It was the kind of smile that sits on top of something deeper, like a manhole cover over a well. I'm good, Chuck, he said. Just thinking. Don't hurt yourself, Barkley said. The audience laughed. Kenny Smith laughed. Ernie Johnson shook his head the way he always does. The fatherly, Lord give me strength head shake that has become one of the most beloved gestures in sports television. Shaq laughed too. But his hand, under the desk where the cameras couldn't see, was holding something. A folded piece of notebook paper with wide ruling, green crayon, a drawing of a giant. He carried that letter in his jacket pocket for 6 weeks, every day, every single day, until the morning he walked into the billing office and placed a black card on the counter and said 3 words to a woman whose daughter had written him 9. But finding Maribel and Isa would prove far more difficult than Jerome anticipated. And the reason for that difficulty, the reason it took 6 weeks instead of 6 days, involved a detail that would eventually connect this story to a summer afternoon in Newark, New Jersey, in 1997, in a way that made everyone involved question whether anything in life is truly random, or whether some things are simply waiting to complete themselves. To understand what happened in Atlanta in 2024, you have to go back. Not just back in time. Back into a version of Shaquille O'Neal that most people have never met. A version that existed before the 4 championship rings, before the $400 million in career earnings, before the endorsement deals, and the movie roles, and the reality shows, and the doctoral degree, and the statue outside Staples Center, before all of it. You have to go back to the summer of 1997, to a 25-year-old man who was, by every measurable standard, on top of the world, and who was, by every standard that can't be measured, still trying to figure out what the world was supposed to mean. July 1997, Newark, New Jersey. Shaquille Rashawn O'Neal had just completed his first season with the Los Angeles Lakers. He'd been traded, or more accurately, he'd left, from the Orlando Magic in a free agency move that had shattered the hearts of every Magic B fan in Central Florida and had made Shaq the most talked-about athlete in America for reasons that had nothing to do with basketball. The Orlando Sentinel had run a poll asking readers whether they would welcome Shaq back. The results were devastating. The city felt betrayed. The narrative was set. Shaq was a mercenary. Shaq chased money. Shaq abandoned the team that drafted him. The narrative was incomplete, as narratives about famous people almost always are, but it stuck, and it hurt, more than Shaq admitted publicly, more than the jokes and the bravado and the massive personality let on. He was 25. He was making $120 million over 7 years with the Lakers, a contract that was at the time the largest in NBA history. He had endorsement deals with Pepsi, Reebok, and Taco Bell. He had released 4 rap albums, including Shaq Diesel and Shaq Fu, Da Return, which had collectively sold over 2 million copies. Not because the music was exceptional, but because Shaq did everything at maximum volume, including making records. He had starred in 2 movies, Kazam, in which he played a genie who emerges from a boombox, and Steel, in which he played a superhero who wears a suit of armor, both of which had been savaged by critics with the kind of gleeful brutality that critics reserve for athletes who dare to act. He was 25, and he was everywhere, and he was enormous. Not just physically, not just financially, but existentially. His presence in any room, any city, any conversation was so large that it created a gravitational field. People orbited him, cameras followed him. Strangers shouted his name from across streets, from car windows, from balconies, from passing boats. He could not go anywhere without being recognized, approached, touched, photographed, asked for something. And in July 1997, he went home. Not to Orlando, which had rejected him. Not to Los Angeles, which hadn't fully accepted him yet. Not to San Antonio, where he was born on March 6, 1972 at Fort Sam Houston, while his biological father, Joseph Tony, was somewhere else. Always somewhere else, a man whose absence was so complete that it became its own kind of presence, a vacuum that shaped Shaq the way wind shapes rock, through persistent, invisible force. He went home to Newark, New Jersey, the city where Philip Arthur Harrison, U.S., Army Sergeant, stepfather, disciplinarian, the man Shaq calls his real father, the man who showed up when the biological one didn't, had been stationed at various points during Shaq's childhood. Newark in the early 1980s, and again in the late 80s. Newark during the crack epidemic, during the crime wave, during the years when the city's homicide rate was among the highest per capita in the nation. Newark, where a boy who was already 6 feet tall at age 12 was simultaneously the most visible person on any street and the most vulnerable, because size attracts attention, and attention in that neighborhood was not always friendly. Newark had shaped Shaq in ways that Los Angeles and Orlando never could. Newark taught him that the distance between having everything and having nothing was thinner than people who have everything want to believe. Newark taught him that poverty is not an abstract concept. It's a specific smell. It's the smell of a hallway in military housing where the heating works intermittently and the carpet hasn't been replaced since the Carter administration. It's the smell of government cheese and powdered milk and fabric softener used on clothes that have been worn 3 days in a row, because there are only 4 outfits and laundry costs quarters. Shaq went back to Newark in July 1997 because Philip Harrison told him to. Not in those words. Philip Harrison didn't make suggestions. He made statements, declarations, pronouncements carved in the granite of his authority. What he said. During a phone call in late June, while Shaq was in his new house in Beverly Hills, a house so large that the echo in the living room could be measured in seconds, was this: "You're getting too far from where you started. Go back." Remember was it. No explanation, no elaboration. Philip Harrison communicated in the same compressed language that Shaq would later adopt in his most important moments. "Find her. Put it on this." The Harrison men spoke in detonation, small, precise, and final, so Shaq went back. He visited the Boys and Girls Club on South Orange Avenue. This was not a photo opportunity. This was not a scheduled appearance. There were no cameras, no press releases, no social media posts, partly because social media didn't exist yet in any meaningful way, and partly because Shaq didn't want anyone there. He told his agent not to call anyone. He told his publicist to take the day off. He drove himself, something he almost never did, because driving when you're Shaq's size is a logistical challenge that involves custom seat modifications and a permanent state of negotiation between knees and steering wheels. The Boys and Girls Club on South Orange Avenue had been a lifeline for Shaq as a teenager. It was where he first played organized basketball, not the playground ball that happened on courts with bent rims and cracked asphalt, but structured, coached, refereed basketball. It was where a man named Dale Brown, the legendary LSU head coach, who happened to be visiting a military base in Germany, where the Harrisons were stationed, and saw a 14-year-old Shaq, and thought he was an enlisted soldier because of his size, had first identified Shaq's potential and begun the process that would lead to a full scholarship to Louisiana State University. The Boys and Girls Club was sacred ground. Shaq returned to it the way a pilgrim returns to a shrine. Not for what it could give him now, but for what it had given him then. He spent 3 hours inside. He played basketball with the kids. He let them climb on him. He did the things he always did, the performance of joy that is also genuinely joy. Shaq's relationship with children has never been performative. It is the most authentic part of his public life. He is, around kids, exactly who he was before the money and the fame and the gravitational field. A big kid himself, delighted by silliness, powered by laughter, fundamentally incapable of taking himself seriously. But it was after the visit, on his way out, that everything changed. He was walking to his car, a black Suburban, because Suburbans are one of approximately 4 vehicles that can accommodate a 7-1 driver without requiring orthopedic intervention afterward, when he saw her, a woman, sitting on the bench outside the building, in the shade of a catalpa tree that had been there since the 1970s, its branches heavy with the long bean-like seed pods that catalpa trees produce in summer. She was holding a baby. The woman was small, Filipino, though Shaq didn't know that at the time. He didn't ask her ethnicity, and she didn't offer it. She was wearing a white t-shirt and jeans. Her hair was long and black and tied back. She was young, maybe mid-20s, and she was sitting very still, the way people sit when they are past the point of panic and have entered the flat, gray country beyond it, where everything is quiet and nothing makes sense and the body simply stops, because the mind has no more instructions to give. The baby was in her lap, bundled in a thin blanket despite the July heat, and even from 10 feet away, walking toward his car, not looking for anything, not expecting anything, Shaq could see that something was wrong. The baby's skin was yellow, not the warm yellow of jaundice that newborns sometimes get and that clears up in a week. A deeper yellow, the yellow that comes from a liver that isn't working, the yellow that is a color and a warning and a countdown all at once. Shaq stopped. He could have kept walking. He was Shaquille O'Neal. He was 25 years old. He had a black Suburban waiting. He had a flight back to Los Angeles in the morning. He had a life that was so full of people and obligations and noise that one more person, one more stranger on one more bench, would have disappeared into the blur the way thousands of strangers had before. He could have kept walking. He didn't. "Excuse me," he said. "Is the baby okay?" The woman looked up. She didn't recognize him. She didn't care who he was. She was on that bench because she had nowhere else to be, and the Boys and Girls Club was a public building with shade. And the baby needed shade because the baby had a fever and the heat was making it worse. Her name was Lucinda. Lucinda Constantino. She told Shaq what was wrong. She spoke quietly, in accented English, the accent of someone who had learned the language in the Philippines and perfected it through use, but whose tongue still remembered Cebuano and sometimes shaped English words with Cebuano curves. She told him the baby had a liver condition, biliary atresia, a disease in which the bile ducts inside or outside the liver are blocked, preventing bile from draining. Without treatment, it's fatal. The treatment is surgery, a procedure called a Kasai portoenterostomy, in which a surgeon connects the liver directly to the small intestine, bypassing the damaged ducts. The surgery cost money. Lucinda didn't have money. She had applied for Medicaid, the federal and state program that provides health coverage to low-income individuals. But her application had been denied. A paperwork error, a missing document, a bureaucratic misfire that, in a system designed to help people who have nothing, had managed to give this woman who had nothing even less than nothing. False hope followed by a form letter that said denied in a font that probably wasn't bold, but felt bold, felt like it was shouting. She had been sitting on this bench for 2 hours, not waiting for anything, just sitting, because the apartment she was staying in, a room she rented from a cousin's friend in a house on Avon Avenue, was hot and small and had no air conditioning, and the baby needed to be cool, and this bench had shade. She didn't ask Shaq for anything. She just answered his question, "Is the baby okay?" "The baby is not okay." Shaq reached into his pocket. He pulled out cash. He didn't count it, didn't separate bills, didn't calculate an appropriate amount. He took what was there, and he gave it to her. Later, he would estimate it was somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000. Walking around money, the kind of cash that a 25-year-old NBA superstar carries the way most people carry breath mints, automatically, without thinking, because it's always there. For Shaq, it was pocket change. For Lucinda, it was a lifeline thrown across an abyss. "Take this," he said. "Get the baby to a hospital." Lucinda stared at the money, then at him. Her eyes were dry. She had passed the point of crying, had entered that country beyond tears where the body conserves its water because it doesn't know when the drought will end. "I can't take this," she said. "You're taking it. I don't know who you are. Doesn't matter. Take it." She took it. Her hands were shaking, not from emotion, not from gratitude, but from the physical exhaustion of holding a sick baby in July heat for 2 hours on a bench with no plan and no help, and no future that she could see. Shaq pulled a card from his wallet. Not a credit card, but a business card. His assistant's number. "If you need more," he said, "call this number. Tell them Shaq sent you." She nodded. She didn't say thank you. Not because she wasn't grateful, but because gratitude, when it is large enough, doesn't have a word. The word thank you was built for smaller moments, for held doors and past salt shakers and rides to the airport. It wasn't built for this. Nothing in the English language was built for the moment when a stranger hands you the possibility that your child might live. Shaq walked to his Suburban. He got in, he drove away. He didn't look back, not because he didn't care, because he was 25, and he had not yet learned the lesson that the next 27 years would teach him. The lesson that giving is not a transaction. It is not a moment. It is a thread. And threads, if you follow them long enough, lead somewhere. He didn't ask her name. He heard Lucinda, but didn't write it down. He didn't ask the baby's name. He didn't leave his own name. She didn't know she was speaking to Shaquille O'Neal, and he didn't tell her. Because in that moment it was irrelevant. And he was right that it was irrelevant, and he was wrong that it would stay irrelevant. He didn't follow up. He didn't call his assistant to check if Lucinda ever used the number. He didn't hire someone to find out if the baby got the surgery, if the Medicaid situation was resolved, if the liver healed, if the child survived. He just left, and the moment dissolved. The way moments dissolved in 1997, before the internet turned every human interaction into a permanent record, before smartphones made witnesses of everyone, before kindness became content and generosity became a genre, and doing something good for another person became indistinguishable from performing something good for an audience. The moment dissolved, and Shaq went back to Los Angeles, and the season started, and the Lakers went 61-21, and lost to the Utah Jazz in the Western Conference semifinals, and life continued at its enormous pace. But the moment didn't dissolve completely. It stayed. The way a splinter stays. Not visible, not always painful, but present, embedded, beneath the surface of every other day. Shaq thought about Lucinda. Not every day, not obsessively, but regularly. In the quiet moments. In the car between appearances. In the dark of his bedroom at 2 a.m. When the performance was over, and the cameras were off, and the only audience was his own conscience. He thought about her because he didn't know the ending. Every other act of generosity he performed, and there were thousands, literally thousands, over the decades, had an ending. He bought a family their furniture at Best Buy. He saw their faces. He knew they went home happy. He paid for a stranger's engagement ring at Zales. He watched the man cry with joy. He covered funeral costs for a child he'd never met. He spoke to the family on the phone. He heard their gratitude. He knew, at least, that the help had landed. But Lucinda was an open loop, a story without a final chapter, a question asked and never answered. Did the baby live? 3 words. The most important 3 words of his life, more important than put it on this, more important than we are champions, more important than any 3 words he'd ever spoken on television or in an interview or in a movie. Did the baby live? He didn't know, and it ate at him, quietly, the way water eats stone, not violently, not dramatically, but persistently, over years and years, until the stone has a groove in it that wasn't there before. A channel, a path carved by the weight of not knowing. Shaq became, over the following decades, one of the most generous athletes in the history of professional sports. The numbers are staggering. An estimated $20 million in personal charitable giving, not foundation money, not corporate-sponsored philanthropy, but cash out of his own pocket. He bought shoes, thousands and thousands of shoes, for children who couldn't afford them. Through partnerships with Zappos and JCPenney. He paid for meals. He paid for funerals. He tipped waitresses amounts that made them sit down and cry. In 2021, he reportedly bought laptops for an entire school in McDonough, Georgia. He partnered with Carnival Cruise Lines, Epson, and dozens of other brands. And he used every partnership as an opportunity to funnel resources toward people who needed them. But every time he gave, every single time, for 27 years, there was a flicker. A small, silent flicker in the back of his mind. The bench, the baby, the yellow skin. The woman who said, "I can't take this," and took it anyway, because her child's life depended on her setting aside her pride and accepting help from a stranger. Did it work? Did the money reach a doctor? Did a surgeon operate? Did the bile ducts clear? Did the liver heal? Did the yellow fade from that tiny body? Did the baby grow? Did the baby walk, talk, go to school, make friends, scrape knees, blow out birthday candles? Did the baby live? 27 years. That question lived inside Shaquille O'Neal for 27 years. He never spoke about it publicly. Not in interviews, not on podcasts. Not in his autobiography, Shaq Uncut, published in 2011, not on Inside the NBA. Not to Charles Barkley or Kenny Smith or Ernie Johnson, the three men he sat next to multiple nights a week, under studio lights, cracking, joke, and arguing about basketball while carrying, somewhere beneath the laughter, a splinter that had been there since before any of them knew each other. He told one person, his mother Lucille O'Neal. Lucille, born Lucille Harrison, raised in Newark, a woman who raised Shaq and his siblings with a combination of fierce love and unyielding expectation that produced not just an NBA legend, but a genuinely decent human being. Which is the harder achievement by far. Listen to her son describe the woman on the bench. The baby, the cash, the business card, the not knowing. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You did what you could. The rest isn't yours to carry." It was wise advice. It was correct advice. Shaq knew it was correct. He carried it anyway, because some things refuse to be set down. Some questions are heavier than their answers. And the question, "Did the baby live?" is the heaviest question a person can carry, because it contains inside it every other question. About purpose, about consequence, about whether a single moment of kindness on a July afternoon can bend the arc of a life, or whether it just disappears into the heat like water on asphalt. For 27 years, Shaq carried that question. And then, on January 2, 2024, a letter arrived at Turner Studios in Atlanta, written in green crayon, addressed to Mr. Shaq O'Neal, the biggest man on the TV basketball show, from a 7-year-old girl named Issa, who was sick but was going to be okay because her mom said so, and her mom never lies. Her mom, a nurse at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, a woman named Constantino Reyes, Constantino. Shaq didn't make the connection immediately. How could he? He didn't know Lucinda's last name. He'd never asked. 27 years ago, on a bench in Newark, last names weren't part of the conversation. Survival was the conversation. Money was the conversation. The baby's yellow skin was the conversation. But Jerome Crawford would make the connection. 6 weeks later, after a search that took him from Jonesboro Road to a women's shelter in College Park, Georgia, after phone calls and dead ends and a pastor who guarded her residence like a lioness guards cubs, Jerome would uncover a detail that would stop him cold in his office chair and make him pick up the phone and call Shaq with hands that were, for the first time in 4 years of working for a 7-1 giant, shaking. A detail about Maribel's maiden name. A detail about a surgery in Newark in 1997. A detail about a baby with yellow skin who grew up to become a nurse who was now drowning in medical bills for her own sick daughter. A circle, drawing itself closed. Across 27 years and 1,000 miles and 2 generations of women who were saved and who saved others and who needed saving again. But that discovery was still weeks away. First, Jerome had to find them. And the search would begin with an empty apartment, a neighbor named Clement, and a forwarding address that led to a place where broken women went to be held together by a pastor with hands strong enough to carry the weight of other people's lives. Jerome Crawford started with the envelope. Apartment 4B, Jonesboro Road, South Atlanta. No zip code, but Jerome didn't need one. He'd lived in Atlanta for 11 years. He knew Jonesboro Road the way a river knows its banks. It runs south from downtown, cutting through Clayton County, through neighborhood that real estate agents describe as transitional, and that residents describe more honestly as hanging on. Strip malls with check-cashing stores and beauty supply shops and churches. So many churches, because in neighborhoods where the systems have failed, faith is not a luxury. It is infrastructure. Jerome drove there on Saturday, January 6, 2024. 4 days after the letter arrived. He went alone, no driver, no security. He took his own car, a gray 2021 Hyundai Tucson, modest and forgettable, which was exactly the point. You don't roll up to a low-income apartment complex in a black Escalade with tinted windows when you're trying to have a quiet conversation. You show up in a Hyundai. You park in visitor parking. You walk like someone who belongs, because the fastest way to make people in a neighborhood like this stop talking to you is to look like you don't belong there. The apartment complex was called Magnolia Ridge. The name was aspirational. There were no magnolias. There was no ridge. There was a 2-story rectangular building, brick on the first floor, vinyl siding on the second, both in a shade of beige that suggested the building had given up on aesthetics sometime around 2006 and never looked back. The parking lot had potholes deep enough to lose a shoe in. The dumpster near the entrance was overflowing. A basketball hoop with no net stood at the far end of the lot, its backboard cracked diagonally. A wound that someone had attempted to repair with duct tape, which was both futile and heartbreaking in the way that duct tape repairs always are, a declaration that we will fix what we can with what we have, even when what we have isn't enough. Apartment 4B was on the second floor. Jerome climbed the exterior staircase, metal, painted black, the paint peeling in long curls, and walked along the open-air corridor to the fourth door on the left. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Harder. The door rattled in its frame. The hollow, tinny rattle of a door that was more of a suggestion than a barrier. No answer. He stepped back and looked at the window. Many blinds closed. But through the gaps he could see something that made his stomach drop. Nothing. The apartment was empty. Not empty as in nobody's home. Empty as in nobody lives. Here no furniture, no curtains, no sign of habitation. The carpet, visible through the blinds in a narrow stripe, was the kind of carpet that appears when everything that was sitting on it has been removed. Flattened, stained, ghosted with the rectangular imprints of furniture that used to be there and isn't anymore. Maribel was gone. Jerome stood on the corridor for a moment, recalibrating. This was not unexpected. He'd worked for Shaq long enough to know that finding real people in the real world is never as simple as going to an address. People move, people disappear. People's lives shift under their feet like sand, and the address they had last week is not the address they have this week. Because last week they could make rent, and this week they couldn't. And the distance between two weeks is the distance between a door with your name on it and a door that rattles when a stranger knocks because you're already gone. He knocked on the next door, apartment 4A. It opened almost immediately, as if whoever was inside had been watching through the peephole the whole time. Which, of course, they had. Because in apartment complexes like Magnolia Ridge, a stranger knocking on your neighbor's door is an event. It is information. It is potentially a landlord, a debt collector, a process server, or a cop, none of which are welcome. And the people who live in these buildings survive, in part, by watching. The man who answered was old. Not elderly, old in the way that certain men are old, where the age is less about years and more about mileage. He was maybe 65, maybe 75. It was hard to tell. He was wearing a white undershirt, gray sweatpants, and slippers that had been slippers so long they were now just flat pieces of fabric with memories of cushioning. His hair was white and cut close. His eyes were sharp, sharper than the rest of him, which had the slightly stooped, slightly weathered quality of a man who had spent decades doing physical labor and was now living in the aftermath of it. His name was Clement, just Clement. He offered no last name, and Jerome didn't ask for one, because asking for a last name from a man who hasn't offered one is a way of saying I might need to find you later, and Clement was not a man who wanted to be found later by anyone. She's gone, Clement said before Jerome could ask. Maribel? Apartment 4B? Clement studied him. The study was thorough. Eyes moving from Jerome's face to his clothes, to his shoes, to his hands, to the Hyundai in the parking lot. Assembling a profile the way a detective assembles a profile, except Clement wasn't a detective. He was a retired maintenance worker from Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, who had spent 31 years fixing things that broke, and who had developed, through those decades of observation, an almost preternatural ability to assess people. You a collector? Clement asked. No, sir. Process server? No. Police? No. Nothing like that. Then what? Jerome hesitated. He had prepared for this question, but the answer was complicated. How do you explain to a 65-year-old man in slippers that you work for a 7'1" former basketball player who received a letter in green crayon from a sick child and is now trying to find the child's mother so he can pay her medical bills? The sentence sounds absurd even when it's true. Especially when it's true. I work for someone who wants to help her, Jerome said. Her daughter wrote us a letter. Clement's expression changed. Not dramatically. Clement was not a man of dramatic expressions. But something shifted. A softening around the eyes. A slight relaxation of the jaw. The micro-adjustments of a face that has decided the person in front of it is telling the truth. Little Issa, Clement said. You know her? Everybody knows Issa. He said it the way you'd say everybody knows the sun. Not as a statement of popularity, but of luminosity. Ice was, apparently, the kind of child who was known in the way that certain children are known, not because they seek attention, but because they radiate something that attention seeks. A warmth, a frequency. The kind of kid who talks to the mailman and names the stray cats and draws pictures for the neighbors and slides them under doors with notes that say, "This is you. I drew you happy." And the drawing looks nothing like you, but the happiness is unmistakable. She's a good kid, Clement said. Smart. Too smart for 7. She talks to my cat through the wall. She thinks my cat can hear her. My Cape paused, rubbed his jaw, looked away, toward the parking lot, toward the basketball hoop with the cracked backboard, toward something that wasn't visible. Her mama couldn't make rent. Last month, the landlord gave her 2 weeks. She was already behind from when the little girl got sick. You know about that? I know she's been in treatment. Clement nodded. Maribel, she didn't complain. Not once. Not ever. I've been in this building 8 years. Maribel moved in 4 years ago. 4 years, and I never once heard that woman complain. She worked nights, came home in the morning, slept a few hours, got up, took care of Isa, went back every day, like a machine. He pondered this time. Then Isa got sick, and Maribel, she didn't break. She bent. Like a tree in wind, she bent and bent and bent. But last month, I think the wind got too strong. Jerome asked the question. Do you know where she went? Clement looked at him again, that assessing gaze, that 31 years of reading people gaze. There's a place in College Park, women's shelter, haven of light, run by a pastor, big woman, voice like a church organ, Dorothea Tillman. Maribel mentioned it once. Said one of the nurses at the hospital told her about it, said if things got too bad. He stopped, swallowed. And in that swallow, Jerome saw something that Clement would never have admitted to, and would have denied if confronted with. A flicker of pain. The specific pain of a neighbor who watched a single mother carry an impossible load for 4 years and couldn't help. Who lived on the other side of a thin wall, the same thin wall that Isa listened through at night, and heard things he couldn't fix. If things got too bad, Clement repeated, she'd go there. Jerome thanked him, extended his hand. Clement shook it, a firm grip, calloused, the handshake of a man who had fixed 31 years of broken things. You said someone wants to help her, Clement said as Jerome turned to leave. Yes, sir. Is it real? The help? Because that woman has had enough of things that aren't real. Enough promises that don't hold. Enough systems that say they're there for you and then aren't there for you. So if this is real, actually real, then you find her. You find her and you help her. And if it's not real, then you get in your little Hyundai and you drive away and you don't come back. It's real, Jerome said. Clement held his gaze for 3 full seconds, then nodded once. A single dip of the chin. The nod of a man who has decided to believe against his better judgment, because the alternative, not believing, is heavier. Haven of Light, Clement said. College Park, off Camp Creek Parkway. Tell Dorothea that Clement sent you. She won't trust you otherwise. She doesn't trust anybody otherwise. Jerome drove to College Park that afternoon. College Park, Georgia. A small city of roughly 14,000 people, tucked directly south of Atlanta, living in the perpetual shadow and noise of Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. whose runways are so close that the planes taking off seem to skim the rooftops of the houses below. It is a community that has been shaped, geographically, economically, acoustically, by the airport the way a riverbank is shaped by the river, constantly eroded, constantly rebuilt, never quite stable. Haven of Light Family Services was located on a residential street off Camp Creek Parkway, in a converted two-story house that had been painted yellow. Not a bright, cheerful yellow, but a warm, tired yellow, the yellow of a place that has been open for a long time and has absorbed a lot of pain into its walls and has chosen to remain standing anyway. The front porch had a swing. The yard had a garden, winter bare in January, but the stakes and string for the summer tomato plants were still in the ground, an act of faith in a season that hadn't arrived yet. Pastor Dorothea Tillman met Jerome at the front door. She was, as Clement had described, a big woman. Not big the way Shaq is big. Shaq is big the way a mountain is big, a geographical event. Dorothea was big the way an oak tree is big. Rooted, broad, unshakable, the kind of big that makes you feel safe simply by existing nearby. She was 58 years old. She had been born in Americus, Georgia, a small city in the southwestern part of the state, known primarily as the birthplace of Habitat for Humanity and for being the place where civil rights workers were jailed during the Albany movement in the 1960s. She had a degree in social work from Fort Valley State University. She had been ordained as a minister in the African Methodist Episcopal Church at age 32. She had opened Haven of Light in 2002, using $12,000 of her own savings and a loan she secured by putting up her mother's house as collateral, a decision that her mother, a woman named Eudora, had approved with 4 words: "Houses are for living, so are people." In 22 years, Pastor Dorothea Tillman had sheltered over 1,400 women and children. She had a waiting list that never got shorter. She had a budget that never got bigger. She ran the shelter on a combination of government grants, church donations, and the kind of fiscal creativity that would make a Wall Street analyst weep. Not from admiration, but from the sheer impossibility of the math. She made it work because she refused to accept that it couldn't work. Refusal was her superpower. She refused poverty. She refused bureaucracy. She refused the statistical inevitability that most of the women who came through her door would end up back where they started. Roughly 70% of Haven of Light's residents, over the shelter's 22-year history, had achieved stable housing and employment within 18 months of entering the program, in an industry where a 40% success rate is considered exceptional. 70% was a miracle, and Dorothea did not believe in miracles. She believed in work. She believed in structure. She believed in holding people accountable while simultaneously holding them up. She believed that a woman who arrives at your door at midnight with a garbage bag full of clothes and a child on her hip is not a case number. She is a cathedral that has been damaged by weather, and cathedrals can be restored. She also believed in not letting strangers into her shelter. "Who are you?" she said to Jerome. "Not hostile, not friendly. Neutral, the way a border guard is neutral. Professional, watchful, aware that the person in front of them might be fine or might be a threat, and unwilling to assume either until evidence arrives. My name is Jerome Crawford. I work for Shaquille O'Neal. Clement from Magnolia Ridge sent me. I'm looking for Maribel Constantino Reyes. I believe she may be staying here." Dorothea looked at him. Her gaze was different from Clement's. Clement assessed with the eyes of a maintenance worker, looking for what was broken. Dorothea assessed with the eyes of a pastor, looking for what was true. "I have 23 women and 14 children in this house," she said. "I don't confirm or deny who any of them are to anyone who shows up at my door, regardless of who they say they work for. If Shaquille O'Neal wants to send a donation, the mailing address is on the website. If this is about a legal matter, contact our attorney. If this is about anything else, I'll need more than a name and a neighbor's recommendation." Jerome had expected this. He'd prepared for it. He pulled out his phone and showed Dorothea the letter. He'd photographed it in Shaq's dressing room with Shaq's permission, specifically for moments like this. The green crayon, the wobbly handwriting, the postscript about fitting in cars. Dorothea read it on the phone screen. Her expression didn't change. Her expression was a fortress, built to withstand exactly this kind of emotional siege, because in 22 years of running a shelter, she had learned that emotions are not evidence, and that the most dangerous people are often the ones who arrive with the most compelling stories. She handed the phone back. "I'll need to verify this independently," she said. "Give me a number. I'll call you if, and only if, the person you're looking for wants to be found." It took 4 phone calls over 2 weeks. Jerome called Dorothea. Dorothea called him back. Jerome provided additional verification. Shaq's Foundation tax ID, Jerome's employment records, a reference from a contact at Turner Broadcasting's legal department. Dorothea checked every piece of it. She called Turner Broadcasting directly and asked to be transferred to the mailroom. She spoke to Carolyn Benford. Carolyn confirmed the letter. Dorothea hung up and called Jerome. "She's here," Dorothea said, "but she doesn't know you're looking for her, and I need to understand what happens next before I tell her." "What happens next," Jerome said, "is that my employer wants to help with her daughter's medical bills." Silence on the line. A long silence. The kind of silence that has texture, dense, layered, full of things that aren't being said. "How much?" Dorothea asked. "All of it." Another silence. This one shorter. This one ending with a sound that Jerome almost missed, a sharp intake of breath. Quick, controlled. The sound of a woman who has spent 22 years refusing to be surprised, finally being surprised. "I need to talk to Maribel," Dorothea said. "And then I need to talk to your employer directly. Not you. Him. That can be arranged. Tomorrow." "I'll call tomorrow evening." She called the next evening. Shaq was in his apartment in Atlanta, a penthouse in Buckhead, the affluent northern district of the city, with views of the skyline that stretched to Stone Mountain on clear days. He took the call in his living room, standing, because Shaq often stands during important phone calls. Something about being vertical helps him focus. Something about his full height, even when no one can see it, makes him feel ready. The conversation lasted 45 minutes. Jerome was not in the room. He was told later that Shaq and Dorothea discussed Maribel Issa, the medical situation, the financial situation, and the logistics of how to provide help to a woman who had been raised to believe that accepting help was a form of failure. Dorothea explained the Constantino family code. The phrase Issa had quoted in her letter, "Constantinos don't ask people for things. We earn them," was not a saying. It was a doctrine, passed from Lucinda to Maribel, rooted in a specific cultural context, the Filipino concept of hiya, which translates roughly as shame, but means something deeper. A sense of social propriety, a reluctance to impose, a belief that self-sufficiency is not just a virtue but an obligation, and that needing help is a burden you place on others that you have no right to place. Maribel would refuse. Dorothea was certain of it. If Shaq walked in and offered to pay, Maribel would thank him politely and say no. She would say she was fine. She would say she had a plan. She would lie, not maliciously, but protectively, the way mothers lie when they say everything's going to be okay while the ground is opening beneath them. The plan that emerged from that 45-minute phone call was Dorothea's idea. Don't go to Maribel. Go to the hospital. Visit the pediatric ward, a routine appearance the kind Shaq did regularly through his foundation. Meet Issa. Build a connection. Let the relationship develop naturally, organically, so that when the financial help arrived, it didn't feel like charity from a stranger. It felt like care from someone who knew her daughter, someone who had sat with Issa and heard her knock-knock jokes and discussed cats versus dogs and made a pinky promise. Someone who had earned the right to help. The word earned was deliberate. Dorothea chose it because she knew it was the only word that could penetrate the Constantino armor. Not charity, not donation, not gift, earned. A word that honored Maribel's code rather than overriding it. Visit the child first, Dorothea told Shaq. Let Issa see that her letter worked. Let her see that the biggest man on the TV basketball show read her words and came. And then, when the moment is right, and you'll know when the moment is right, because the moment will tell you, handle the bill. Shaq agreed. But there was one more piece. One more element that had to fall into place before February 14. Jerome needed to know the exact amount of Maribel's medical debt. Not an estimate, not a range. The number. Because when Shaq walked into that billing office, if he walked into that billing office, there could be no hesitation, no back and forth with administrators about totals and balances. And what's covered and what isn't. The card goes on the counter, the number gets charged. Clean, final, the way Shaq does everything that matters. To get the number, Jerome needed help from inside the hospital. He needed Dr. Priya Nagarajan. And reaching Dr. Nagarajan, convincing her to share financial information about a patient's family with a stranger claiming to represent a celebrity, would require something that Jerome, in 4 years of solving impossible logistical problems for Shaquille O'Neal, had never before had to deploy. A shared memory of a three-peat. And a date on a medical chart that would stop every clock in the room. February 14, 2024, 11:17 a.m., the billing office. The black card was on the counter. The administrator, a man named Gerald, who had worked in hospital billing for 11 years, and who had processed approximately 40,000 patient accounts in that time, and who had never, in any of those 40,000 accounts, had a 7'1" man walk into his office unannounced and place an American Express Centurion card on his desk, was staring at the card the way a person stares at something their brain has received but has not yet agreed to process. "Sir," Gerald said, "the balance on this account is, I don't care what it is. Sir, it's 200 and, I heard you. I don't care, run the card." Gerald looked at Maribel. Maribel looked at Shaq. Shaq looked at neither of them. He was looking at the wall behind Gerald's desk, at the laminated poster about payment plan options, at the fake plant in the corner, at anything that wasn't a pair of human eyes, because if he looked into Maribel's eyes right now, swollen, red, bewildered, still wet, he was going to lose the composure he was holding together with nothing but willpower and the memory of Philip Harrison's voice saying, "Men don't cry in public." Shaquille, which was terrible advice that Shaq had spent a lifetime unlearning, but which, in this specific moment, was the only scaffolding he had. Gerald looked at the card again, then at his computer screen, then at the card. He picked it up, gingerly, the way you pick up something that might be a mirage, and turned it over in his hands. The black card. The mythological black card. Gerald had heard of it. Everyone in billing had heard of it. It was the financial equivalent of a unicorn. Something you knew existed in theory but never expected to touch. "I'll need to process this as a third-party payment," Gerald said. His voice had found its professional register again, the safe harbor of procedure. When reality becomes too strange, procedure is what remains. "I'll need a signature, and I'll need to confirm the cardholder's identity." "My name is Shaquille O'Neal," Shaq said. Gerald blinked. It was the blink of a man who had known. Of course he had known. The man was 7 feet tall, but who had not allowed himself to know. Because knowing would have required reacting, and reacting would have required him to step outside the script that 11 years in billing had tattooed into his nervous system. "I'll need an ID," Gerald said. Shaq pulled out his driver's license. "Georgia, Class C." The photo showed his face compressed into the tiny rectangle that the DMV allots for faces. A rectangle designed for normal-sized humans. Which meant Shaq's photo looked like someone had tried to fit a billboard into a picture frame. Height 3'7", eyes, BRN Shaquille Rashan O'Neal. The most recognizable face in the room, possibly the most recognizable face in the city, presenting identification to a man who was sitting 4 feet from him. Gerald examined the license, compared it to the face, compared it to the card, typed something into his computer, typed something else. His fingers were shaking slightly, not from fear, not from nervousness, but from the biochemical reality of being an ordinary person in the middle of an extraordinary moment. Adrenaline doesn't care about context. It fires the same whether you're being chased by a bear or watching a stranger pay $287,000 for another stranger's medical bill. "The total," Gerald said, his voice now carrying the particular quality of a man who is about to say a number that he has said hundreds of times to hundreds of people. but that has never, until this moment, been met with anything other than devastation, is $287,412.16. $287,412.16. The 16 cents. The absurd, merciless, mathematically precise 16 cents. As if the hospital billing system, in its infinite algorithmic indifference, had calculated exactly how much it cost to save a child's life and had determined that the answer included 16 cents. Not a round number, not a clean number, a number with a tail. A number that, after the hundreds of thousands, after the big figures that crush and the medium figures that erode, still had the audacity to tack on 16 cents, as if the universe wanted to make sure that the final insult was also the smallest. "Run it," Shaq said. Gerald swiped the card. The machine was silent for a moment. The 3-second eternity that every credit card transaction occupies, the digital purgatory between purchase and approval, during which the magnetic strip communicates with a satellite, that communicates with a server, that communicates with a bank, that determines whether or not this particular arrangement of digits has permission to redistribute wealth from one account to another. The machine beeped. Approved. Of course it was approved. The black card doesn't decline. That's the entire point of the black card. It exists in a financial universe where the word declined has been deprecated, removed from the vocabulary, replaced with a permanent, unconditional yes. Gerald looked at the screen. He looked at the receipt printing from the machine, a long, thin strip of thermal paper. The same kind of paper that prints grocery store receipts and gas station receipts and every other small, disposable record of every other small, disposable transaction. Except this receipt was not small. This receipt was $287,412.16. This receipt was a child's life. "Would you like a copy?" Gerald asked. "Give it to her," Shaq said. He nodded toward Maribel. Maribel. She had not spoken, not a word, not since the door opened, not since the giant walked in, not since the card hit the counter, not since the 3 words, "Put it on this," landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. She had not spoken because she was not in a condition to speak. She was in the condition that exists beyond speech, beyond language, beyond the entire architecture of human communication. She was in the place where the body takes over, where the heart beats and the lungs breathe and the eyes see and the hands shake and the mind, overwhelmed, retreats to some inner room and locks the door and waits for the world to start making sense again. She was holding the billing statement, still. The same piece of paper she'd been holding when the door opened. The same piece of paper with the number that had been killing her for 6 months. But the number was dead now. The number had been neutralized. The number was, as of 11 seconds ago, 0. And the piece of paper in her hands was no longer a death sentence. It was a historical document. An artifact of a crisis that had just ended, though her body hadn't received the message yet, because bodies are slow to update their understanding of reality. They hold on to fear long after the threat has passed, the way a fist stays clenched after the fight is over. Gerald held out the receipt. Maribel took it with the hand that wasn't holding the billing statement, so now she had 2 pieces of paper. One in each hand, the old number and the new number, the before and the after, held in shaking fingers, like a person standing at the border between 2 countries, holding a passport in one hand and a map in the other. She looked at the receipt, $287,412, paid in full. She looked up at Shaq, and this is when it happened. This is the moment. The moment that changes the story from something beautiful into something that shouldn't be possible. The moment that Jerome, standing outside the door with Demetrius and Kwame, would later describe as the moment God decided to stop being subtle. The moment that Dr. Nagarajan, when she heard about it hours later, would sit within her office for 20 minutes, to move, unable to think, her hand over her mouth, because medical science, her entire discipline, her entire framework for understanding the world, has no mechanism for explaining what happened next. Maribel looked at Shaq. Her eyes were still red. Her hands were still shaking. The tears were still wet on her face, still catching the fluorescent light and refracting it into tiny spectrums that nobody noticed, because nobody looks at the physics of tears when they're watching someone cry. But something shifted. Not in the room, in her face, a change. Subtle, like a cloud moving off the sun. Not sudden, not dramatic, but unmistakable. The bewilderment began to drain from her expression. The shock began to recede. And in their place, something else rose. Something that looked, at first, like recognition. Not the recognition of fame, not, "Oh, you're Shaquille O'Neal." She still didn't care about that. She would never care about that. Celebrity recognition operates on a frequency that Maribel Constantino Reyes was not tuned to and had never been tuned to, because her frequency was occupied by more important signals. The beep of a heart monitor, the pitch of a child's cry, the particular silence of a sleeping daughter who is going to be okay, because her mom says so and her mom never lies. This was a different kind of recognition, deeper, older, the recognition of something that the body knows before the mind does. The recognition that happens when you encounter a person you've never met, but who is, in some way you cannot explain, already part of your story. The recognition that happens when a face, a specific arrangement of eyes and brow and jaw and skin, triggers not a memory but a pre-memory, an inherited memory. A memory passed from mother to daughter through stories told on the floor of a small apartment in Cebu City, over rice and tinola on the last night before everything changed. A giant came. Maribel's lips parted, barely, a millimeter. The micro-movement of a mouth that is forming a word it hasn't chosen yet. A word that is being assembled somewhere deep in the brain, where language and memory and identity converge. She looked at his hands, enormous hands. Hands that had held basketballs and trophies and microphones and children. Hands that had just placed a black card on a counter as casually as most people place a napkin on a table. Hands that 27 years ago on a bench in July in Newark had held out cash to a woman holding a baby with yellow skin. Maribel didn't know that. Not consciously. Not with the part of her mind that processes facts and makes decisions and pays bills. But some other part of her, some part that lived below cognition, below reason, in the basement of the self where instinct and inheritance share a room. That part knew. That part had always known. "You don't remember me," she said. Her voice was small. Not weak. Maribel's voice was never weak. Small the way a seed is small. Compact. Containing everything. Shaq looked at her. "But you knew my mother." The room contracted. The walls didn't move. The ceiling didn't lower. The floor didn't shift. But the space between things tightened. The air became denser. Gerald, behind his desk, stopped breathing. He would later say he didn't realize he'd stopped breathing until he started again. 30 seconds later, gasping slightly, because even a billing administrator with 11 years of professional detachment can recognize when reality has changed states. When the solid ground of an ordinary morning has become something liquid, something molten, something that is being reshaped in real time by forces that have nothing to do with hospitals or billing or insurance codes. My mother's name was Lucinda Constantino. Shaq's hand moved to the edge of the desk, not reaching for it, gripping it. The way a person grips a railing when the ground shifts. Instinctive, involuntary, the body's emergency response to a loss of equilibrium. In 1997, Maribel continued, she was sitting outside a Boys and Girls Club in Newark, New Jersey. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The fake plant stood in its corner. The laminated poster offered payment plans that no longer mattered. She was holding a baby. The baby was sick. A very tall man stopped and asked what was wrong. Shaq's knuckles were white. The desk, a standard-issue laminate office desk rated to hold a computer monitor and a printer and a stack of files, was bearing weight it was never designed for. The downward pressure of a 325-pound man's hand, channeling 27 years of not knowing into 5 points of contact against a beige surface. He gave her money. He told her to call a number. Maribel's voice was not shaking anymore. The shaking had stopped. Something had steadied her. The act of speaking, of giving language to a story that had lived inside her for her entire life. A story she had heard once and carried forever. A story that was her origin myth, her genesis, her answer to the question that every human being asks at some point, why am I alive? She was alive because of a bench and a giant and a handful of cash that a 25-year-old man didn't count. The baby was me, Maribel said. I was the baby. 5 words that traveled across 27 years the way light travels across space, at a speed that cannot be measured by clocks, only by impact. 5 words that arrived at Shaquille O'Neal's ears and detonated inside his chest with a force that had no physical analog, no equivalent in the world of things that can be weighed and measured and put in boxes. I was the baby. The question that had lived in him since that July Saturday. The question that had burrowed into his bones and nested there and whispered to him at 2 a.m. In every city, in every hotel room, in every quiet moment for 27 years. Did the baby live? The baby lived. The baby grew up. The baby went to nursing school. The baby became a woman who spent her career holding other people's sick children. The baby had a daughter, and the daughter got sick. And the daughter wrote a letter, and the letter found him. The baby was standing in front of him. 5'2", green scrubs, hair coming undone. Eyes that were Lucinda's eyes, the same eyes that had looked up at him from a bench in Newark. Dry and exhausted and beyond hope, except that they hadn't been beyond hope, because here was the proof that hope had been answered. Here was the proof standing in wrinkled scrubs in a billing office with a receipt for $287,412.16 in one shaking hand and the old bill in the other, alive and real and present, a living answer to a question he had been carrying like a stone in his chest for nearly 3 decades. Did the baby live? Yes, God, yes, the baby lived. She named me Maribel because it was her mother's name, Maribel said. Her voice was cracking now. Not breaking, cracking, the way earth cracks when something is pushing up through it, something green, something alive. But she used to tell me I had 2 births. The first one when she had me, and the second one, the day a giant paid for my surgery and I got to live. Shaq didn't speak. He couldn't speak. He was a man of words. On television, in interviews, on podcasts, in locker rooms, in press conferences, he was quick and loud and funny and sharp. He had made a second career out of language, out of the well-timed joke, the devastating comeback, the one-liner that would trend on social media for 3 days. He was, by any measure, one of the most verbally gifted athletes of his generation. Not in the polished, scripted way of athletes who hire speechwriters, but in the raw, improvisational, jazz musician way of a man who thinks in punchlines and speaks in rhythms. But there are moments that words cannot reach. Moments that exist in a register above language, or below it, or beside it. In the space where the things that matter most live, the things that are too large for syllables, too heavy for sentences, too true for the approximate, imprecise, always slightly wrong medium of human speech. This was one of those moments. Trying to speak would have been like trying to catch a waterfall with a teacup. The water would overwhelm the vessel. The vessel would shatter. And the water would continue falling, indifferent to the attempt, because waterfalls do not care about teacups, and some truths do not care about words. Shaq sat down, not in a chair on the floor, all 7'1" of him, all 325 pounds. The custom Tom Ford jacket, and the tailored pants, and the size 22 shoes. All of it, lowering to the industrial carpet tiles of the billing office floor, the way a mountain would lower itself if mountains could kneel. His back against the wall. His legs extended across the width of the small room, nearly reaching the opposite wall, because his legs were that long, and the room was that small. And he cried, not the polite kind, not the celebrity kind, the kind that happens on talk shows, the single photogenic tear rolling down the cheek while the host reaches for a tissue, and the audience says, "Aww," and the moment is moving but manageable, contained, broadcastable. This was the other kind. The kind that Maribel had been doing 5 minutes earlier. The raw, guttural, body-shaking kind. The kind that comes from the place below the lungs, below the stomach, from whatever subterranean chamber of the human interior holds the things we've been carrying for so long that we've forgotten we're carrying them. Until the moment we set them down and feel, for the first time, the true weight of what we've been holding. 27 years. He had been carrying the question for 27 years. And now the question was answered. And the answer was not just yes, the baby lived. The answer was standing in front of him in green scrubs. The answer was a nurse. The answer was a mother. The answer was a woman who had dedicated her life to doing for other children what he had done for her. Stopping, showing up, being the difference. The answer was Maribel. And the weight of that answer, the sheer, staggering, reality-bending weight of learning that the baby he saved in 1997 had grown into a woman who saved babies for a living, who had a daughter who got cancer, whose daughter wrote him a letter, whose letter brought him back to the same hospital, the same kind of moment, the same act of grace. 27 years later, that weight broke something open in him that had been sealed shut since the day he drove away from that bench, in his black Suburban, and didn't look back. He cried on the floor of the billing office. He cried the way men cry when they have spent decades being strong, and the strength is no longer needed, and the body, finally, is allowed to do what it has wanted to do for 27 years, which is grieve, not for something lost, but for something found. For the time between. For all the nights he wondered. For all the years the question lived in him unanswered. For Lucinda, who he never saw again. For the bench. For the cash he didn't count. For the moment he walked away and the 27 years of not knowing if walking away was the worst thing he'd ever done. It wasn't. It was the best thing. Because walking away had created a vacancy. A space in the story where the answer could grow. And the answer had grown. Through Lucinda's sacrifice and Maribel's education and Isa's letter and Carolyn's intuition and Jerome's persistence and Clement's trust and Dorothea's protection and Priya's courage. Through all of these people, each one a link in a chain that stretched from a bench in Newark to a floor in Atlanta, the answer had grown. Demetrius stepped into the hallway. He didn't need to be told. He had been with Shaq for 6 years. He knew the difference between a moment that needed protection and a moment that needed an audience. This moment needed protection. Demetrius stood outside the door, all 6'2" of him, a Marine who had served 2 tours and had a face that discouraged questions, and he guarded that door the way he had guarded positions in Fallujah, with total commitment, with the understanding that whatever was happening on the other side of that door was not his to see, but was absolutely his to defend. Jerome turned off Kwame's camera without being asked. Kwame, a 30-year-old videographer who had filmed hundreds of hours of Shaq content, who had captured events and appearances and brand activations and behind-the-scenes footage for Shaq's personal media archive, lowered the camera and nodded. Some things are not content. Some things are not footage. Some things exist only in the room where they happen, and the room is their container. And removing them from that room, digitizing them, uploading them, posting them, making them available for consumption by strangers who will watch for 30 seconds and then scroll to the next thing, would be an act of violence, a violation, a theft of something that belongs to 2 people and to no one else. Kwame understood this. He was 30 years old, and he understood something that the entire architecture of social media is designed to make people forget. That the most important moments of a human life are not content. They are not shareable. They are not optimized for engagement. They are sacred in the original sense of the word. Set apart, untouchable, belonging to the silence between 2 people who are discovering that their lives have been entangled since before either of them knew it. What happened inside that billing office over the next 15 minutes has never been recorded. It has never been posted. It has never been described in an interview or a podcast or a tweet or an Instagram story. It belongs to Shaq and Maribel. But when the door finally opened, 15 minutes later, at 11:34 a.m., on February 14, 2024, Valentine's Day, the day of love, which had turned out to be exactly the right day for what had just happened. 2 things were visible. Shaq's eyes were swollen. The whites had gone red. His nose was running. His Tom Ford jacket had a wet spot on the shoulder, the kind of spot left by a forehead pressed against fabric, by a small person leaning into a large person and letting the large person hold the weight for a while. And Maribel was holding his hand. Both of hers wrapped around one of his. Her hands, small, nurses' hands. Hands that had started IVs and administered medications and held dying children and wiped tears and checked pulses and done all of the 1,000 daily acts of care that constitute a life spent in service to others, were wrapped around his hand the way a child holds a parent's hand. Not because she needed support, because she needed contact, because the human body, when it has been through something too large for the mind to process, reaches for the nearest solid thing and holds on. She was saying something. The same thing, over and over, quiet enough that only Shaq and Demetrius, who was standing closest to the door, could hear. She always told me the giant would come back. She always said he'd come back. Lucinda Constantino, who had sat on a bench in Newark in 1997 with a baby with yellow skin and no money and no insurance and no plan, who had received cash from a stranger and used it to get her daughter to a hospital and into surgery, who had carried that moment, that single, pivotal, life-altering moment, across 2 decades and 2 continents, who had told the story once to Maribel on the last night before Maribel left for America, who had called the stranger a giant, as if he were a figure from folklore, from the old stories, from the world of Capra and mythical beings who appear when the need is greatest and disappear when the need is met, who had believed, against all reason, against all probability, against the cold mathematical reality that the world is vast and people are small and the chances of 2 lives intersecting twice across 27 years are approximately 0, that the giant would come back. Lucinda had passed away on March 11, 2019. Complications from type 2 diabetes. She was 63 years old. She died at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta, 47 minutes from Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, where her daughter worked and where, 5 years later, her granddaughter would be treated for leukemia by an oncologist who watched the Lakers three-peat with her father. Lucinda never got to see the giant come back. She never got to see Maribel's face when the door opened. She never got to see the black card on the counter. She never got to see her daughter holding the giant's hand in a billing office while saying the words that Lucinda had planted in her like seeds decades earlier. She never got to see any of it. But she was right. She was right the way mothers are right about the things that matter most. Not because they have evidence, not because the odds are in their favor, not because logic supports their position, but because they know. Because maternal certainty operates on a different frequency than rational certainty. Because Lucinda had looked into the face of the giant on the bench and had seen something there. Something in his eyes. Something in the way he handed over the money without counting it. Something in the way he said, "Take it," with a voice that brokered no debate. And she had known, with the kind of knowing that doesn't require proof, because it is its own proof, that this was not a random encounter. This was a beginning, and beginnings by definition have middles, and middles have ends. And the giant would come back because the story wasn't finished. Because you don't save a baby's life on a bench in New Jersey and then disappear into the remainder of history without consequence. Because the universe has a memory, even if people don't. Because the thread that connected the giant to the baby on the bench was not made of chance. It was made of something stronger, something that doesn't fray, something that stretches across years and miles, and the deaths of mothers, and the births of granddaughters, and the terrible arithmetic of medical bills without breaking. Lucinda knew, all she always knew. And standing in the hallway of Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, holding the hand of a man who was crying because he had just learned that his oldest unanswered question had been answered. That the baby lived. That the baby became a healer. That the baby's daughter brought him back. Maribel knew too. The giant came back. 27 years late, right on time, the 287,412 was not the end. It was not even the climax. It was the hinge. The point at which the story pivoted from crisis to reconstruction, from falling to building, from the weight of what had been lost to the architecture of what could be gained. Because paying a bill is an event. It happens in a moment. A card, a machine beeps, a number becomes 0. The moment is dramatic and important and real, but it is still just a moment. What matters, what always matters, what separates a viral headline from an actual changed life, is what happens after the moment. What happens in the days and weeks and months that follow, when the cameras are gone and the story has left the news cycle, and the person who was saved has to wake up every morning and build a life on the ground that was cleared. Shaq knew this. He knew it because of Lucinda, because of the bench, because of the 27 years he spent not knowing whether the cash he'd given had actually changed anything. He had walked away in 1997, and the not knowing had haunted him, not because the giving was wrong, but because the giving was incomplete. He had provided a resource without providing a foundation. He had put out a fire without rebuilding the house. He would not make that mistake again. Within 72 hours of Valentine's Day, Jerome Crawford was in a conference room at the law offices of McKinnon, Greer and Associates on Peachtree Street in Midtown Atlanta, sitting across from a trusts and estates attorney named Noelle Ashford Baptiste. Noelle was 41 years old. She had graduated from Howard University's School of Law, clerked for a federal judge in the Northern District of Georgia, and spent the last 12 years building a practice that specialized in what she called dignity planning, the creation of financial structures for people who had experienced sudden changes in economic circumstance, whether through inheritance, settlement, lottery, or, in rarer cases, the intervention of a benefactor. Noelle had worked with Shaq's team before, 3 times, in fact, once for a family in Marietta whose house had burned down and whom Shaq had helped relocate, once for a teenager in Decatur whose college tuition Shaq had funded, and once for a situation that Noelle was contractually prohibited from discussing, but that had involved a former NBA player, a gambling debt, and a level of financial complexity that had required Noelle to work 18-hour days for 3 weeks straight. She was good at her job. More importantly, she was good at the human part of her job, the part that law school doesn't teach, the part that involves sitting across from a person whose life has just been altered by someone else's generosity, and helping them understand that generosity, when it arrives at this scale, is not a gift. It is a structural event. It changes the load-bearing dynamics of a life. And if you don't build the right supports around it, the structure can collapse under the weight of its own good fortune. This happens more often than people think. Studies from the National Endowment for Financial Education suggest that approximately 70% of people who receive a sudden financial windfall, lottery winners, inheritance recipients, beneficiaries of large charitable gifts, lose that money within a few years. Not because they're irresponsible, not because they're foolish, because money, when it arrives suddenly and in large amounts, creates a kind of vertigo. The ground that was solid yesterday is different today. The rules that applied before, the rules of scarcity, of careful budgeting, of choosing between groceries and gas, no longer apply. And in the absence of those rules, without new rules to replace them, people spend. They give to family members. They make investments they don't understand. They buy things they don't need. Because buying things is the only language their culture has taught them for expressing the feeling of no longer being poor. Noelle's job was to prevent that, to build a framework, legal, financial, structural, that would ensure Shaq's help didn't just eliminate the crisis, but prevented the next one. The plan she designed, in consultation with Jerome and with Shaq's financial advisor Yvette Moreau, a 53-year-old former Goldman Sachs analyst who had managed Shaq's personal investments for 7 years and who approached wealth management with the emotional warmth of a Swiss watch and the precision to match, was comprehensive without being extravagant. It had 5 components. The first was the medical debt, which was already handled. $287,412 paid, 0 balance. The receipt, the thin strip of thermal paper that Gerald had printed in the billing office, was filed in Noelle's office as a legal record. But the debt was only the past. The treatment was ongoing. Isa's chemotherapy protocol, as outlined by Dr. Nagarajan, was expected to continue for another 12 to 18 months. There would be additional costs, infusion sessions, blood work, imaging, the experimental targeted therapy component that insurance had classified as investigational, follow-up appointments that would continue for years after treatment ended, because pediatric cancer survivors require long-term monitoring, because the body remembers what was done to it even after the disease is gone. Shaq's team established a medical trust. Not a blank check. Evett was philosophically opposed to blank checks, even philanthropic ones, because she believed that structure protects both the giver and the recipient. The trust was funded with $150,000 and administered through Children's Health Care of Atlanta's own financial assistance office. Any medical expense related to Isa's treatment, current or future, covered by insurance or not, would be submitted to the trust for payment. The trust had a 3-year term, renewable at Shaq's discretion. It was designed to outlast the treatment, because cancer doesn't end when the chemotherapy stops. Cancer ends. If it ends, if you're lucky enough to use that word, years later, after the scans are clean and the blood counts are normal, and the oncologist says the words "no evidence of disease," and you allow yourself cautiously, provisionally, with one hand still on the railing, to exhale. The second component was housing. Maribel and Isa were living at Haven of Light, Pastor Dorothea Tillman's shelter, the yellow house on Camp Creek Parkway with the garden stakes still in the ground. It was safe. It was warm. Dorothea's care was as close to maternal as a professional environment could be. But it was a shelter. It was temporary. It was a place between places, a holding pattern, a waiting room for a life that hadn't started yet. Jerome found an apartment in Decatur, Georgia, a city that sits just east of Atlanta, known for its walkability, its excellent public schools, its independent bookstores and coffee shops, and its particular quality of community that feels deliberate rather than accidental. Decatur is the kind of place where neighbors know each other's names and where the farmer's market on Saturday mornings is not a lifestyle accessory, but an actual gathering, a weekly ritual of commerce and conversation that functions as the connective tissue of civic life. The apartment was on Church Street. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, hardwood floors. A kitchen window that looked out not onto a parking lot with a car alarm, but onto a small courtyard with a magnolia tree, a real magnolia tree, not the aspirational kind that existed only in the name of a housing complex. The building was old, built in 1948, brick, 3 stories, the kind of mid-century residential construction that Atlanta has in abundance. Buildings that have survived urban renewal and highway construction, and the 1996 Olympics, and the relentless churn of development that has transformed much of the city into a landscape of glass and steel and luxury condominiums named after trees that were cut down to build them. Rent $650 a month, not luxury. The Goldilocks zone of Atlanta housing, affordable enough to be sustainable, nice enough to be dignified. Evett negotiated a 3-year lease, prepaid, funded through a separate account established in Maribel's name. The account was structured so that rent payments were automatic, drafted on the 1st of each month. No action required from Maribel, no monthly reminder that someone else was paying for the roof over her head. This was Evett's idea. She understood, with the analytical precision that made her exceptional at her job and occasionally difficult at dinner parties, that the psychology of receiving help is as important as the economics of it. Every month that Maribel had to consciously acknowledge the rent was being paid by someone else was a month that the Constantino Code, we earn things, we don't accept them, would scrape against her self-respect like sandpaper. Automatic payments eliminated the scraping. The rent was handled. The roof was secure. Maribel could direct her energy toward the things that mattered. Isa's treatment, her own career, the process of rebuilding a life that had been dismantled by the intersection of childhood cancer and American healthcare economics. The third component was transportation. Maribel's 2006 Honda Civic, Lola, the stubborn grandmother car with 187,000 miles and an intermittent air conditioner and a check engine light that had been on so long it had become a permanent feature of the dashboard, like a freckle, was not reliable enough for a single mother driving a child with a compromised immune system to and from a hospital in Atlanta traffic. Atlanta traffic is not a minor consideration. It is a force of nature. The city's highway system, built in the 1960s and 70s with the optimistic assumption that Atlanta would remain a medium-sized southern city, an assumption that the subsequent 5 decades of explosive growth rendered laughable. is among the most congested in the United States. The average Atlanta commuter spends roughly 82 hours per year sitting in traffic, according to the Texas A&M Transportation Institute's Urban Mobility Report. For Maribel, driving from Decatur to Children's Healthcare of Atlanta for Isa's appointments, a reliable car was not a convenience. It was medical infrastructure. Shaq wanted to buy her a Range Rover. Yvette said no. Yvette said a Range Rover was a $90,000 vehicle with $3,000 annual maintenance costs and the fuel efficiency of a small aircraft carrier. Yvette said a Toyota Camry. Shaq's Camry was boring. Yvette said boring is the point. Boring is reliable. Boring starts every morning. Boring doesn't break down on I-285 at rush hour with a neutropenic child in the back seat. Boring is what you buy when the goal is function, not flash, Shaq conceded. He conceded because Yvette was right, and because Yvette was always right about money, and because Shaq, despite his public persona of extravagance and excess, was privately one of the most financially disciplined athletes of his generation, a man who had watched too many of his peers go bankrupt, who had studied their mistakes, who had built a post-basketball business empire worth an estimated $400 million by listening to people like Yvette and overriding his own impulses. They bought a 2023 Toyota Camry, silver, LE trim, Apple CarPlay, blind spot monitoring, 39 miles per gallon on the highway, boring, perfect. Jerome arranged for the car to be delivered to the parking lot of Haven of Light on February 21, 2024, 1 week after Valentine's Day. He left the keys with Pastor Dorothea, who placed them in an envelope with a handwritten note. The note said, "For Maribel and Isa, from a friend, no strings, just wheels." Dorothea added her own note underneath. "Accept this, baby, even trees need rain, DT." Maribel cried when she saw the car. Then she opened the door and sat in the driver's seat and adjusted the mirrors and turned on the air conditioning. Fully functional, immediate, cold, glorious, reliable air conditioning. And she sat there for 10 minutes with her hands on the steering wheel, not driving, just sitting, feeling the hum of an engine that didn't rattle, feeling the cool air that didn't stutter, feeling the absence of the check engine light, a dashboard that was clean and dark and unblemished, a dashboard that said everything is working in the silent language of machines. Lola, the 2006 Civic, the stubborn grandmother, was donated to Haven of Light. Pastor Dorothea gave it to another resident, a 26-year-old woman named Keisha, who had 2 sons and a job at a distribution center in Forest Park that she'd been getting to by bus. 2 buses, actually, a transfer at 5 Point Station, 90 minutes each way. Keisha, when she received the keys, said 3 words that sounded familiar to Jerome, who was present for the handoff. "Is this real?" The 4th component was education. A 529 college savings plan, established in Isadora Constantino Reyes' name, seeded with $50,000, invested in a moderate growth portfolio managed by Yvette's team. At a conservative average annual return of 6%, the account would be worth approximately $95,000 by the time Isa turned 18. Enough for 4 years of in-state tuition at a Georgia public university. The University of Georgia, Georgia Tech, Georgia State, Kennesaw State. Enough to ensure that Isa's future would not be defined by her illness. That the cancer would be a chapter, not the whole book. Shaq insisted on one condition. Maribel would not be told the exact amount. She would know the fund existed. She would know it was growing. She would not know the number. Because Shaq understood, instinctively, without Yvette or Noel having to explain it, that a specific number creates a specific obligation. And obligation for a woman raised under the Constantino Code would transform a gift into a debt she would spend the rest of her life trying to repay, not in money but in gratitude, in deference, in the slow erosion of the self-respect that was as essential to Maribel's identity as her nursing license. No number, no obligation, just a fund, growing quietly, like a magnolia tree outside a kitchen window, present without demanding attention, there when it's needed. The 5th and final component was the simplest and, in some ways, the most important. Shaq asked Jerome to find out when Maribel could return to work. Not because Maribel needed to work. The financial support package had bought her time, had created a cushion that she'd never had before. But because Shaq understood something about Maribel that the Constantino Code made explicit, and that his own upbringing, under the iron discipline of Philip Harrison, identity is not separate from work. For Maribel, being a nurse was not a job, it was who she was. It was the expression of the promise she made to Lucinda at the airport in Cebu. It was the living embodiment of the story of the giant, the decision to be someone who stops. Take that away, even temporarily, even with the best intentions, even padded with financial cushions and prepaid rent and reliable cars, and you take away the thing that makes Maribel Maribel, the thing that gets her out of bed, the thing that steadies her hands when she inserts an IV into a child's arm at 3 a.m. and whispers, you're okay, I'm right here." Jerome coordinated with Children's Health Care of Atlanta's Human Resources Department. Maribel's leave of absence had technically expired. Her position in the pediatric ICU had been held, a courtesy from her unit manager, a woman named Tracy Beckford Lane, who had managed the PICU for 14 years and who had fought hospital administration to keep Maribel's slot open, because good pediatric ICU nurses are not replaceable. They are not interchangeable. They are not resources to be allocated and reallocated according to spreadsheet logic. They are specific people with specific gifts. And Maribel's specific gift, her calm, her precision, her ability to be simultaneously tender and clinical, to hold a parent's hand with one hand while adjusting a ventilator with the other, was irreplaceable. Maribel returned to work on March 4, 2024. She requested the night shift, 11 p.m. to 11 a.m., the same shift she'd worked when she first came to America, the shift that most nurses avoid, the dark hours, the quiet hours, the hours when the hospital feels less like a building and more like a vessel, a ship sailing through the night with its cargo of small, fragile passengers. She requested the pediatric ICU, the same floor where Isa had been treated, the same hallway, the same nurse's station. She wanted to be there, not despite the memories, but because of them. Because she wanted every parent who walked onto that floor at midnight, terrified and disoriented and unable to breathe, to see a face that said, I know. I've been where you are. I'm still here, so will you be. I want to be the nurse that other mothers see when they're scared, she told Pastor Dorothea on the phone the night before her first shift back. I want to be the proof that it can be okay. She was the proof. She clocked in at 10:47 p.m. on March 4, 2024. She changed into clean scrubs, green, always green. The color had become part of her identity the way the white coat is, part of a doctor's identity, a uniform that says, I am here to help you in a frequency that frightened parents can detect before a single word is spoken. She checked her patient assignments. She reviewed charts. She washed her hands. The ritualistic, thorough, 30-second hand wash that every nurse performs dozens of times per shift. The wash that is simultaneously a medical protocol and a meditation, a clearing of the slate, a preparation for contact with another human being's most vulnerable moment. And then she walked into her first patient's room, a 4-year-old boy named Marcus. Post-operative, cardiac surgery. His mother was asleep in the recliner next to his bed. Or trying to sleep, which is a different thing. The kind of sleep that parents do in hospitals, the surface sleep, the sleep that is really just a body lying down while a mind stays vertical. Listening for alarms, listening for changes in breathing, listening for the specific quality of silence that means something is wrong. Maribel checked Marcus's vitals, adjusted his IV, noted his output, pulled his blanket up, not because the medical situation required it, but because he was 4, and the blanket had slipped, and 4-year-olds should be covered. It's not in the nursing manual, it's in the human manual. She was back. Meanwhile, Isa continued her chemotherapy. The treatments were brutal. All chemotherapy is brutal. A controlled poisoning, a calculated destruction of the body's own cells, in the hope that the cancer cells will die faster than the healthy ones. But Isa endured them with a quality that Dr. Nagarajan described in her clinical notes as remarkable resilience, which is the medical way of saying that Isa was tougher than most adults. Dr. Nagarajan had treated, and Dr. Nagarajan had treated 800 patients, and she did not use the word remarkable lightly. Isa vomited. Isa lost weight. Isa's immune system collapsed and rebuilt and collapsed again, the cyclical destruction and resurrection that chemotherapy imposes on the body like a tide, ebbing and flowing, retreating and returning, each cycle leaving the shore slightly different than before. But Isa also laughed. Isa named the IV pole Gerald, after the billing administrator, because Isa had met Gerald briefly on Valentine's Day and had decided that he looked like a Gerald, which he was. But Isa didn't know that. She just thought the pole looked like a Gerald. Isa drew pictures, dozens and dozens of pictures, in crayon, in marker, in colored pencil, on whatever paper was available. She drew cats. She drew her mother. She drew the magnolia tree outside the new apartment window. She drew Shaq, repeatedly, obsessively, in various configurations. Shaq dunking, Shaq eating. She'd heard about the meatball subs. Shaq fitting into a tiny car. The postscript question had never been satisfactorily answered. Shaq standing next to Domingo the cat. Domingo, in these drawings, was approximately the size of a horse, which was either artistic license or an accurate representation of Domingo's personality. She drew one picture that Maribel framed. It showed two figures, one very tall, one very small. The tall one was handing something to the small one, a rectangle, colored black, that was clearly meant to be a credit card. The small one was smiling. Above the drawing, in green crayon, always green, Isa's signature color, the color of the letter. The color of the beginning were 4 words. The giant came back. Maribel hung it on the wall of the apartment in Decatur. Next to the framed letter, the original letter, in its original envelope, with the upside-down stamp and the address that included no zip code. Jerome had returned it to Maribel after the billing office. He'd been carrying a photocopy. The original, he said, belonged to the person who did 2 frames, side by side, the letter and the drawing, the call and the response, the question and the answer, the wall of a small apartment on Church Street, in a building built in 1948, in a city called Decatur, in a state called Georgia, in a country where 100 million people carry medical debt and where a 7-year-old girl with leukemia and a crayon changed 2 lives. Her mother's and a giant's. By writing 9 words that obeyed no rule except the only rule that matters when you're 7. Can you help my mom not cry anymore? Yes, he could, he did. And what happened after, the apartment and the car and the trust and the college fund and the return to work and the drawings on the wall, was not the fairy tale. Fairy tales end with the magic. This was better than a fairy tale. This was the morning after the magic. When you wake up and the spell hasn't broken, and the pumpkin is still a carriage, and the glass slipper still fits, and the giant is still standing behind you, quiet and enormous, not because the story requires it, but because he chose to stay. Shaq visited 3 more times over the following months. Once in April, when he brought Isa a pair of custom Shaq brand sneakers, size 2, approximately 1/5 the size of his own, in pink, because Isa specified pink, and Shaq was not in a position to refuse anything Isa specified. Because Isa had written a letter in green crayon that had broken him open on the floor of a billing office, and when a 7-year-old girl does that to you, you give her whatever color sneakers she wants for the rest of your natural life. Once in June, when he brought the entire Inside the NBA crew, Charles Barkley attempted to make Isa laugh by claiming he could dunk better than Shaq. A claim that was statistically, historically, and physically absurd, given that Barkley was 6'5" and 61 years old and had not dunked competitively since the 1990s. Isa was diplomatic about it. She said, "Maybe you could dunk better when you were young." Barkley pretended to be offended. Kenny Smith laughed so hard he had to sit down. Ernie Johnson, who had his own history with cancer, he was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin lymphoma in 2003 and has been in remission since, held Isa's hand for a long time and said something to her that no one else heard, and that Isa later told Maribel was the nicest thing anyone ever said to me. Ernie has never revealed what it was. And once in August, this visit was different. No cameras, no crew, no entourage, no Demetrius standing guard. Just Shaq, driving himself in a Tesla Model X, because he'd moved on from Suburbans, though the seating situation remained geometrically challenging, to Children's Healthcare of Atlanta on a Tuesday afternoon. He didn't visit Isa this time. Isa was at the apartment in Decatur, on a break between treatment cycles, watching SpongeBob SquarePants with Domingo on her lap and a bowl of chicken nuggets. Still 10-piece, still sweet and sour, still no exceptions. On the coffee table, Shaq went to the hospital cafeteria. He sat with Maribel. For 2 hours, he didn't talk about himself. He didn't tell stories about the NBA or TNT or his business ventures or his doctoral research or any of the thousand topics that constitute the public mythology of Shaquille O'Neal. He sat in a plastic cafeteria chair, a chair that protested audibly under his weight, its legs bowing outward in a structural plea for mercy. And he listened. Maribel told him about Lucinda. She told him about Cebu City, about the apartment with the linoleum floor where they ate rice and tinola, about the jeepneys and the call centers and the jasmine and diesel air, about Lucinda's 3 jobs in Newark after the surgery, cleaning offices from 6 a.m. to 2 p.m., watching neighborhood children from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m., doing laundry for a Best Western hotel on weekends. 3 jobs, 7 days a week for 4 years, saving money in a coffee can, a literal Maxwell House coffee can, blue, kept on top of the refrigerator, because Lucinda did not trust banks. Banks were institutions. Institutions were the same species as Medicaid offices that denied claims because of paperwork errors. Lucinda trusted coffee cans and God, in that order, though she would have told you the order was reversed. She told him about Lucinda's decision to move to Atlanta, how Lucinda had heard from a friend at church. Filipino churches in Newark were tightly networked, information traveling through the congregation the way water travels through roots, quietly, efficiently, sustaining everything it touches. That nursing programs in Georgia were strong, and that the cost of living was lower, and that Atlanta had a growing Filipino community centered around Duluth and Suwannee in Gwinnett County, north of the city. She told him about nursing school, Georgia State University. Class of 2011, 5th in her class. How Lucinda had attended the graduation ceremony in a dress she bought at Goodwill. Navy blue, with a white collar, ironed so crisply that the creases could have cut paper, and had sat in the audience and wept with a ferocity that alarmed the families sitting on either side of her, who assumed something was wrong, when in fact everything, for the first time in Lucinda's life, for the first time since the bench and the baby and the surgery and the coffee can and the 3 jobs, everything was right. She told him about Lucinda's diabetes, how it started with thirst, an unquenchable animal thirst that made Lucinda drink water constantly, compulsively, as if her body was trying to dilute something that couldn't be diluted, how it progressed to neuropathy, numbness in her feet, then her legs, then her hands. How Lucinda refused to stop working even as her body shut down, system by system, because Constantinos don't stop. How the last years were hard. Dialysis 3 times a week, the slow erosion of independence, the wheelchair, the apartment that Maribel rented for her in Jonesboro, close to Maribel's own apartment on the same road, so she could check on her mother every morning before work and every evening after. She told him about March 11, 2019. How Lucinda died at 4:17 a.m., the hour of the night that hospitals call the quiet hour, the hour when the machines seem louder because everything else is softer. How Maribel was holding her hand. How Lucinda's last words were in Cebuano, a phrase that Maribel translated for Shaq as, "The tree remembers what the axe forgets." She told him about the funeral. St. Philip Benizi Catholic Church in Jonesboro, 63 people in attendance. Filipino food, lechon and pancit and bibingka, served afterward in the church basement. How Isa, who was 2 years old at the time, sat on the lap of Lucinda's sister, Felicidad, who had flown from Cebu for the funeral and who looked so much like Lucinda that Maribel had to leave the room twice because looking at Felicidad's face was like looking at a ghost that breathed. Shaq listened to all of it, 2 hours. He didn't interrupt. He didn't redirect. He didn't offer commentary or perspective or advice. He didn't try to make it about himself. Didn't say, "I wish I'd been there." Didn't say, "If I'd known." Didn't say any of the things that well-meaning people say when they hear stories of suffering, things that are meant to express empathy, but that actually redirect the emotional energy from the person who lived it to the person who's hearing about it. He just listened. He listened the way Maribel listened to parents on the PICU floor, the way she sat with them at 3 a.m. when their child was sleeping, and they couldn't sleep, and they needed to tell someone, anyone, about the fear. The way she received their words without judgment, without solution, without the compulsive need to fix. The way she understood that sometimes the most healing thing another person can do is simply be present, simply be a surface that absorbs without reflecting, a wall that holds without pushing back. Shaq was that wall. For 2 hours, in a hospital cafeteria, surrounded by the ambient noise of trays and vending machines and the soft footsteps of people walking through the saddest building they would ever enter, the biggest man in the room became the quietest. And Maribel told him the story of Lucinda Constantino, the whole story. From the beginning, from a bench in Newark where a giant stopped. November 8, 2024, a Friday, 9 months after Valentine's Day. The pediatric oncology ward at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta occupies a section of the hospital that is designed, with extraordinary intentionality, to not feel like a hospital. The walls are painted in soft colors, lavender, seafoam, a pale yellow that suggests sunlight even on overcast days. The hallways have murals, painted by local artists, by former patients, by volunteers who show up with brushes and rollers, and the understanding that a child walking to a chemotherapy infusion at 8 a.m. should see something beautiful on the way. Butterflies, forests, oceans, galaxies, a giraffe wearing sunglasses, a rocket ship piloted by a cat. The murals are whimsical and unserious and completely, profoundly serious, because the decision to surround dying children with beauty is one of the most serious decisions a civilization can make. It says, even here, even in this place, even on the worst day of the worst year of the shortest life, beauty matters, color matters, a cat in a rocket ship matters. The bell hangs at the end of the hallway. It is mounted on a wooden plaque. The plaque is attached to the wall at a height of approximately 4 feet, low enough for the smallest patient, the 5-year-old whose legs barely carry them after months of treatment, to reach up and grab the rope and pull. The bell is brass, small, maybe 5 inches in diameter. It was donated in 2009 by the family of a patient named Elijah Thomas, a 9-year-old boy who was treated for osteosarcoma, a bone cancer, and who rang the bell on August 14, 2009, after 14 months of chemotherapy and 2 surgeries, and who is now 24 years old and studying physical therapy at Emory University, and who returns to the ward every December to visit the kids and to touch the bell. Not ring it, just touch it, his fingers against the brass, the way a person touches a doorway they once walked through, when they didn't know if there was anything on the other side. Below the bell is a small engraved plaque. It reads, "Ring this bell 3 times well. It's told to clearly say my treatment's done. This course is run, and I am on my way." The poem is not original to Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. Variations of it exist in oncology wards across the country, at MD Anderson in Houston, at Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York, at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital in Memphis, at Dana-Farber in Boston. The origin of the tradition is generally traced to Rear Admiral Irv Lemoyne, a cancer patient who hung a bell at his radiation treatment center in 1996 and wrote the first version of the poem. The tradition spread the way good traditions spread, not through mandate or marketing, but through the irresistible human need to mark the end of something terrible with a sound. Not just any sound. A bell. A bell is different from other sounds. A bell doesn't fade. It rings and then it resonates. The sound expanding outward from the point of impact in concentric circles, the way a stone creates ripples when it hits water. A bell's sound occupies space. It fills a hallway. It passes through walls. It reaches rooms where other children are still lying in beds, still connected to IV poles, still in the middle of the thing that the bell ringer has just finished. And it reaches those children, and it says, "I was where you are. I made it through. You will make it through too." A bell is not a celebration. A bell is a promise. November 8, 2024, 10 km. The hallway was crowded. This was unusual. The pediatric oncology hallway is typically quiet, a respectful quiet, a library quiet, the quiet of a place where serious things are happening inside rooms and the corridor between them is treated as a buffer zone, a decompression chamber between the intensity inside and the world outside. But today the hallway was crowded because word had spread. Word always spreads. In a hospital, information travels through the staff the way blood travels through the body, carried by nurses who tell other nurses, who tell technicians, who tell custodial workers, who tell cafeteria staff, who tell security guards, who tell the volunteers at the front desk. The official communication channel at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta is an internal messaging system called Vocera. The actual communication channel is a 47-year-old charge nurse named Delphine, who has worked on the oncology floor for 19 years, and who knows everything about everyone, and who told everyone about everything. Approximately 14 minutes after Dr. Nagarajan confirmed Issa's final labs. The labs come back that morning, 7:23 a.m. Dr. Nagarajan reviewed them in her office. The same office where, 9 months earlier, she had sat at her desk and cried after Jerome explained why he was calling. She reviewed the complete blood count. She reviewed the flow cytometry. She reviewed the bone marrow biopsy results from the procedure performed 3 days earlier. A procedure that Issa had endured with her characteristic combination of courage and commentary. "Is this going to hurt?" she had asked Dr. Nagarajan. "A little," Dr. Nagarajan had said. "Okay," Issa had said. "I'm going to pretend I'm a spy and this is part of my mission." "That's a good strategy," Dr. Nagarajan had said. "I know," Issa had said. "I have a lot of strategies." The biopsy results were clean. No detectable leukemia cells. No minimal residual disease. The flow cytometry, a sophisticated laboratory technique that analyzes individual cells by passing them through a laser beam, sorting them by size and surface markers, hunting for the specific cellular profile of acute lymphoblastic leukemia with a sensitivity that can detect one cancer cell among 10,000 normal cells, showed nothing. Nothing. The most beautiful nothing in the English language. The nothing that means everything. The nothing that means a 7-year-old girl, now 8. Her birthday had been on September 12, 3 days of celebration that included a cake shaped like Domingo the cat, a trip to the Georgia Aquarium where she spent 45 minutes talking to the beluga whales through the glass, and a card from Shaq that was so large it required its own chair. The nothing that meant this 8-year-old girl was in complete remission. Complete remission. 2 words that Dr. Nagarajan had spoken thousands of times in her career, but that had never, she would later tell her husband Vikram over dinner that evening, felt like they did this morning. This morning they felt like doors opening, like the massive medieval iron-studded doors of a castle that has been under siege for 14 months. Finally, swinging open to reveal sunlight and grass and a world that still exists. Dr. Nagarajan called Maribel at 7:41 a.m. Maribel was at the apartment in Decatur. She had just finished a night shift. She'd clocked out at 7:15 and driven home on I-20, the highway that cuts east-west through Atlanta like a scar, in the silver Camry that still smelled faintly new, though the new car smell was fading and being replaced by the smell of Isa's life. Chicken nugget grease, crayon wax, the specific sweet-sour scent of a child's shampoo. Maribel answered the phone in the kitchen. She was still in her scrubs. "Green, always green." "Maribel, Dr. Nagarajan said. "The results are back." Maribel's hand found the kitchen counter, the same instinctive gesture, the same reaching for something solid when the ground becomes uncertain. Her fingers pressed against the laminate surface, and she closed her eyes, and she waited for the words. The words that she had been waiting for since September 4, 2023, since the first diagnosis, since the consultation room with the lavender walls and the half-empty box of tissues, since the beginning of the longest 14 months of her life. "Complete remission," Dr. Nagarajan said. "No detectable disease. Maribel, she's clear." Maribel slid down the kitchen cabinets to the floor, not falling, lowering. The controlled descent of a body that has decided it no longer needs to stand, because the thing it was standing against, the weight, the fear, the 14-month-long held breath, has been removed, and, without the weight, the body discovers that it is exhausted, that it has been holding itself upright through sheer will, and that it would very much like to sit on the kitchen floor now, please. among the crumbs and the cat hair and the evidence of a life being lived. And cry, she cried. Not the billing office crying, not the 3 a.m. crying through thin walls, not the breaking kind. The other kind. The kind that sounds like laughter's twin sister. The kind that comes from the same deep place, but travels in the opposite direction, up, instead of down, out instead of in. The kind of crying that is not a collapse but a release. A balloon that has been squeezed for 14 months finally being let go, rocketing upward, spinning wildly, freed. Domingo, alarmed by the sounds emanating from his owner's mother, jumped off the couch and padded into the kitchen and stood at a cautious distance, observing. Domingo was 11 years old. He was a gray tabby with arthritis in his hind legs and a missing canine tooth and an expression of permanent world-weary skepticism. The face of a cat who has seen everything and is impressed by nothing. He had been Isa's constant companion through the entire treatment, sleeping on her bed during the nights she was home, sitting outside the bathroom door during the vomiting episodes, positioning himself in the exact center of whatever blanket Isa was using, as if to say, "This blanket is mine. You may share it because I allow it, not because you have a right to it." Domingo observed Maribel on the floor. He assessed the situation with the diagnostic precision of a creature who has spent 11 years studying human behavior and finding it largely inexplicable. Then he walked over and sat on her lap. He did not purr. Domingo did not purr for civilians, but he sat. And sitting for Domingo was an act of solidarity that surpassed anything in his behavioral repertoire. Maribel held the cat and cried on the kitchen floor, and the morning sun came through the window. The kitchen window that looked out onto the courtyard with the magnolia tree, the real magnolia tree, and lit the room in that specific golden way that morning sunlight has in November in Georgia, when the angle is low and the air is cool and the light seems to apologize for summer's excess by offering something gentler. She called Shaq at 8:15 a.m. He answered on the second ring. He was in his penthouse in Buckhead. He had not slept. Thursday night broadcast post-show production meeting, the usual post-broadcast energy that keeps him wired until 3 or 4 a.m. And that he manages with a combination of meditation, learned from Phil Jackson during the Lakers' years, never fully mastered but consistently attempted, chamomile tea, recommended by his mother Lucille, faithfully consumed, and Forensic Files reruns, his personal sleep aid. The calm narration of murder investigations paradoxically relaxed him. "She's clear," Maribel said. She didn't need to say who. She didn't need to say what. The context was permanent. The context had been permanent since February 14. Shaq was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When does she ring the bell, doctor?" "Nagarajan says we can schedule it within the week." "Schedule it for Friday." "Why Friday?" "Because I need to be there. And I'm in New York on Wednesday and Thursday." Maribel started to protest. "You don't have to come. You've already done so much. You don't need to." But Shaq interrupted her with 6 words that shut down the protest before it could fully form. "I made her a pinky promise. Room 412, February 14. 25 minutes of knock-knock jokes and cat versus dog debates, and a 7-year-old girl extending her pinky finger. Small, thin, the nail bitten to the quick because Isa was a nail-biter. A habit Maribel had tried to break with bitter apple polish and rewards charts, and ultimately accepted as one of those minor childhood imperfections that are secretly not imperfections at all but signatures, the small marks that make a person specifically, irreplaceably themselves. Isa had extended her pinky and Shaq had extended his. A pinky the size of most people's thumbs. A pinky that had gripped basketballs and steered automobiles and pointed at Charles Barkley during on-air arguments about who was the better power forward. And they had hooked their pinkies together, his engulfing hers the way a bear's paw might engulf a sparrow's claw, and Isa had said, "Promise you'll be here when I ring the bell." And Shaq had said, "Promise." A pinky promise. The most sacred contract in childhood jurisprudence. More binding than a handshake. More enforceable than a written agreement. The pinky promise operates under a legal framework that adults have forgotten but that children understand intuitively. A promise made with the smallest finger is held by the largest part of the heart. You do not break a pinky promise. You do not break a pinky promise with a child. You do not break a pinky promise with a child who has cancer. The penalty for violation is not specified in any legal code or ethical framework because it doesn't need to be. The penalty is known. The penalty is the look on a child's face when they realize that the adult they trusted did not do the thing they said they would do. That look. The micro-expression of betrayal that crosses a child's features in the half-second between expectation and disappointment is the worst punishment the human experience has to offer. Worse than prison, worse than fines, worse than anything the judicial system has devised. Shaq would rather have torn his ACL again, both ACLs simultaneously on live television during the NBA Finals, than break this promise. Friday, November 8. He flew from New York to Atlanta on a 6 a.m. Delta shuttle. First class, not because of luxury, but because of legroom. The legroom situation in coach for a man of Shaq's dimensions is not uncomfortable. It is a violation of the Geneva Conventions. He landed at Hartsfield-Jackson at 8:30 a.m. Jerome picked him up. They drove directly to the hospital. He arrived at 9:47 a.m. He was wearing jeans, a gray hoodie, a black baseball cap pulled low. The unofficial uniform of a celebrity attempting to be inconspicuous. An attempt that, for Shaquille O'Neal, is roughly as effective as an elephant attempting to hide behind a mailbox. He was immediately recognized by every person he passed. Nurses, doctors, patients, parents, a janitor named Wendell who asked for a selfie and received one. A 4-year-old boy in a wheelchair who pointed at Shaq and said, big with the authority of a child, making the most important observation of his life. Shaq made his way to the oncology floor. He walked the hallway with the murals, the butterflies, the forests, the cat in the rocket ship. He passed the rooms where children were still in treatment. He nodded at nurses he recognized from his previous visits. He shook hands with Dr. Nagarejan, who was standing at the nurse's station in her white coat, her eyes already red, because Priya Nagarajan cried at bell ceremonies and had given up trying not to cry at bell ceremonies, and had accepted this about herself the way she accepted all irreversible diagnoses, with grace and without resistance. He walked to the end of the hallway. The bell was there, brass, small, waiting. Below it, a crowd had gathered. Not a large crowd. The hallway wasn't large enough for a large crowd. Maybe 30 people. But 30 people who were, each one of them, essential. 30 people who had played a role, visible or invisible, major or minor, knowing or unknowing, in the chain of events that had brought Isadora Constantino Reyes from a diagnosis in September 2023 to this hallway in November 2024. Maribel was there, front row. She was not in scrubs. She had taken the day off, the first voluntary day off she had taken since returning to work in March. She was wearing a white blouse and jeans and earrings, small gold hoops that had been Lucinda's. She was holding a tissue in her left hand. She would need it. Dr. Nagarajan was there, white coat, stethoscope draped over her shoulders. She rarely wore it around her neck. A personal preference, something about the weight on her cervical spine after 20 years. Her eyes were already red. She was standing next to a nurse practitioner named Yolanda, who had administered roughly half of Isa's chemotherapy infusions and who had a talent for making IV insertions feel, if not painless, then at least less like a betrayal. Pastor Dorothea Tillman was there. She had driven from College Park. She was wearing a purple dress, her preaching dress, she called it, the one she wore on Sundays and on days that felt like Sundays, which this day did. She was carrying a Bible, though she wouldn't open it. Some occasions don't need scripture. They are scripture. Carolyn Benford was there, the mailroom worker, 61 years old. The woman who opened the envelope with the green crayon and the upside-down stamp and chose not to put it in the blue bin. She had been invited by Jerome, who had understood from the very beginning, from the moment Carolyn walked into his office without knocking, that this story did not begin with Shaq. It did not begin with Isa. It did not begin with Maribel or Lucinda or the bench in Newark. It began with a 61-year-old woman in a mailroom who read a letter and felt a fist close around her heart and made a choice. Carolyn stood near the back. She was not someone who sought the front of anything. She was a back-of-the-room person, a watcher, a sorter, a quiet engine in the machinery of other people's stories. She was wearing a blue cardigan and glasses on a chain around her neck, and she was holding, in her right hand, a tissue that was already damp. Because Carolyn had started crying in the car on the way to the hospital and had not fully stopped. Amira, Carolyn's granddaughter, 8 years old, the girl whose Wilm's tumor treatment had been the reason Carolyn recognized Isa's letter for what it was holding Carolyn's left hand. Amira had braids, fresh braids, done by Carolyn the night before, 2 hours of pulling and parting and plaiting while Amira sat between Carolyn's knees and watched cartoons and complained about the pulling. The ritual, the sacrament. Jerome was there, standing to the side, phone in hand, filming, just present. And Shaq was there, in the back, because the hallway was small and he was not, and because this moment did not belong to him. This moment belonged to an 8-year-old girl who had earned it with 14 months of chemotherapy and vomiting and hair loss and bone marrow biopsies and IV poles, named Gerald, and a stuffed animal missing an ear and a pink beanie with a cartoon on cat, and a refusal, absolute and unbreakable, to be anything other than herself through all of it. He was wearing the baseball cap, the hoodie. He was trying to be small, which was impossible, but he was trying, and the trying mattered. Isa came down the hallway at 10:03 a.m. She was walking. Under her own power, no wheelchair, no IV pole, no portable monitor. Just her. Her legs, her feet, her body, moving through space the way bodies are supposed to move, freely, without apparatus, without the mechanical entourage that had accompanied her everywhere for the past 14 months. She was wearing the pink beanie with the cartoon cat. She did not need to wear it. Her hair had grown back, short, dark, curling at her ears in a way that it hadn't before the chemo. Chemotherapy sometimes changes hair texture. The hair that grows back is often different from the hair that fell out, curlier, coarser, sometimes a different shade entirely. Isa's new hair was wavy where it had been straight. She liked it. She said it made her look like a movie star. She said Domingo also liked it, though Domingo's opinion on any topic was, as always, difficult to verify. She was wearing the beanie anyway. She had worn it every day of treatment, every infusion, every blood draw, every scan. It was her lucky hat. She was not, at this point in the proceedings, interested in taking chances. She walked the hallway slowly. Not because she was weak. She was not weak. She was, in fact, stronger than she'd been in months, her appetite returning, her weight climbing back toward the growth curve, her energy levels approaching something that Dr. Nagarajan described clinically as age-appropriate, and that Maribel described practically as exhausting. But because she was savoring it, because 8-year-olds understand ceremony even when they can't spell it, because she knew that this walk, this specific walk, down this specific hallway, past these specific murals, toward that specific bell, was a walk she would only take once. And once-in-a-lifetime walks deserve to be taken slowly. She passed the mural with the butterflies. She passed the mural with the ocean. She passed the room where she'd received her first infusion, and the room where she'd thrown up for the first time, and the room where a nurse named Yolanda had held her hand and said it's okay to cry. Baby, and she had cried, and it had been okay. She passed room 412. She slowed. Room 4212, where she met the giant, where she asked him if he got her letter, and he said yes. Where she asked him if he was going to help her mom, and he said, that's why I'm here. Where she asked him how he fit in his car, and he said, I don't really. And she laughed for the first time in 3 days. Where she made him a pinky promise. She looked at the door, closed now, another patient inside, another child in another bed fighting another battle. And she touched the doorframe, lightly, the way Elijah Thomas, the boy who donated the bell, touched it every December when he came back. A gesture of acknowledgement, a nod to the room where something changed, where a letter written in green crayon was answered by a giant in a Tom Ford jacket with a black card in his pocket and 27 years of unanswered questions in his chest. She kept walking. She reached the bell. The crowd was silent. 30 people. No one spoke. No one coughed. No one shuffled. The silence was not empty. It was full, the way a held breath is full, charged with everything that is about to happen. Isa looked at the bell. She looked at the plaque. She read the poem, her lips moving silently, the way children's lips move when they read, forming each word with their mouths before releasing it into comprehension. Ring this bell 3 times well. She reached for the rope, then she stopped. She turned around. She looked through the crowd, past Maribel, who was already crying, past Dr. Nagarajan, who was already crying, past Pastor Dorothea, whose hands were raised toward the ceiling, past Carolyn, who was holding Amira's hand so tightly that Amira would later say her fingers went numb. She looked through all of them, past all of them, to the back of the hallway, to Shaq, standing against the wall, baseball cap, hoodie, trying to be invisible, failing entirely. Isa looked at him. He looked at her. "You came," she said. "I came. I told you I was going to be okay. You did." She held up her right hand, extended her pinky. That small finger, bitten nail, chapped knuckle, the pinky of an 8-year-old who had been through 14 months of war and was standing, upright, alive, in front of a brass bell at the end of a hallway with butterflies on the walls. "Pinky promise kept?" she said. Shaq smiled. Not the big smile, not the TV smile. The other one, the small one. The one that lives underneath all the other smiles. The one that no camera has ever fully captured because it doesn't perform. It just exists. The smile of a man who made a promise to a child and kept it. "Pinky promise kept," he said. Isa turned back to the bell. She grabbed the rope with both hands. She pulled. The bell rang. Once. The sound traveled down the hallway, past the nurse's station, past the murals, past the rooms where other children, 4-year-olds and 6-year-olds and 12-year-olds and teenagers, bald and pale and tethered to machines, some of whom would ring this bell themselves, and some of whom would not, lay in beds and heard it, heard the promise, heard the proof, heard the sound that said, "I was where you are, and I made it through." Twice. Maribel's knees buckled, not a collapse, a genuflection, an involuntary bowing, her body doing what her mind had wanted to do for 14 months, kneel, not in defeat, in gratitude, in the specific posture of a person who has carried something impossibly heavy for an impossibly long time and is finally setting it down. Dr. Nagarajan caught her elbow, held her up. The oncologist and the mother, standing together, held together, the way they had been held together since that first consultation in the room with the lavender walls. Connected by the diagnosis, connected by the treatment, connected by the shared project of keeping one small body alive. 3 times. The third ring was the loudest. Isa pulled the rope with everything she had. All 47 pounds of her. All the strength that 14 months of chemotherapy had tried to take and failed to take because Isa Constantino Reyes was Lucinda Constantino's granddaughter and Maribel Constantino Reyes's daughter, and Constantinos do not break. They bend. They bend and bend and bend, but they do not break. The bell's sound filled the hallway. It passed through walls. It reached rooms. It reached a boy in room 408, who was starting his 3rd round of chemo, and who heard the bell and closed his eyes and thought someday. It reached a girl in room 415, who was post-surgery and groggy, and who heard the bell through the fog of anesthesia and smiled without knowing why. It reached a mother in room 403, who was sitting in a recliner next to her sleeping son, and who heard the bell and pressed her hand against her chest and whispered, "Please, God, let that be us someday." The bell's sound reached all of them, because that's what bells do. They don't discriminate. They don't select an audience. They ring for everyone. For the person pulling the rope, and for the person 3 rooms away who can barely hear it. For the cured, and the still fighting, and the afraid. For the mothers who cry at night when they think their children are sleeping. For the nurses in green scrubs who hold other people's children because it is who they are. For the giants who stop at benches and hand over cash they don't count. For the mailroom workers who open letters they're not supposed to open. For the neighbors who feed deaf cats through apartment walls. For the pastors who paint their shelters yellow. For the oncologists who watch basketball with their fathers at 2 in the morning across the world. For everyone. The bell rang for everyone. Maribel grabbed Isa and held her so tightly that Isa squeaked. An involuntary, high-pitched, startled sound, the sound of a small body being compressed by a love so large it had physical force. Maribel's arms around Isa's thin frame. Maribel's face pressed into the pink beanie, the lucky hat, the talisman, the piece of fabric that had witnessed everything, and was now witnessing this. "Mommy, you're squishing me," Isa said. "I know, baby. You're squishing me a lot. I know. That's okay. You can keep squishing me." Nagarajan wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her white coat that had been wiped so many times during bell ceremonies that the left sleeve had a permanent faint stain from years of mascara and tears and the salt that accumulates on fabric when it is used repeatedly to absorb the overflow of human feeling. Pastor Dorothea lowered her hands from the ceiling. She hadn't spoken. She hadn't needed to. Whatever she had said, upward silently, to the only audience she considered truly important, was between her and the ceiling and whatever existed beyond it. Carolyn held Amira's hand and cried silently and thought about blue bins, about the thousands of letters she had sorted over 14 years, about the ones that went into the blue bin and were answered with signed photos and form letters, about this one letter, this one envelope, this one upside-down stamp. That didn't. And Shaq. Shaq stood in the back and clapped slowly, the way you clap when something is so important that each clap needs to carry its own weight. When the interval between claps is not rhythm but reverence. When each impact of palm against palm is a separate statement, a separate acknowledgement, a separate yes. Clap. You did it. Clap, you're here. Clap, the promise is kept. Clap, the circle is closed. Clap, the baby lived. He clapped, and his eyes were wet, and his baseball cap was pulled low, and his hoodie was zipped to the chin, and he was the largest person in the hallway, and the quietest, and the most invisible, and the most present. All at once, a paradox of size and silence. A giant hiding in plain sight at the back of a crowd of 30 people, who had all, in their own ways, carried a piece of this story to this moment. Isa, still wrapped in Maribel's arms, looked at him over her mother's shoulder. She raised one hand, the right hand, the pinky promise hand, and waved. A small wave. The kind of wave that children give. Not performative, not ceremonial, just, "Hi, I see you, you're there. Thank you for being there." Shaq waved back, same kind of wave. Small for him, which meant it was still the largest wave in the room. Because everything Shaq does is the largest version of itself. Even the small things, even the quiet things, even the things he does when he's trying not to be seen. Later that evening, Studio J Turner Studios, Techwood Drive. The inside the NBA desk, 4 chairs, 4 men. The monitors glowing. The cameras live. The audience watching at home, millions of them, tuning in for basketball analysis and the chemistry of 4 human beings who have spent over a decade together and who communicate in a language that is part sports, part comedy, part family, part something that doesn't have a name but that America has come to depend on the way it depends on certain constants. The sun rising, coffee tasting like coffee. Shaq and Chuck arguing about something that doesn't matter in a way that somehow matters a great deal. Ernie Johnson, the host, the anchor, the gravitational center of the show, the man who holds the whole thing together with a combination of professionalism and fatherly exasperation that has made him one of the most beloved figures in sports broadcasting, looked at Shaq during a commercial break. "You have a good day, big man?" Shaq leaned back in his chair. The chair creaked. It always creaked. The chairs at the inside the NBA desk were reinforced specifically for Shaq. The standard studio chairs had been replaced after an incident in 2013 that the production team refers to only as the collapse. But even the reinforced chair protested under his weight, a small, metallic complaint that had become so familiar it was practically the show's 5th cast member. "Best day of my life," Shaq said. Charles Barkley looked up from his phone. Barkley was always on his phone during breaks, texting, scrolling, doing whatever Charles Barkley does on his phone, which is a mystery that no one on the production team has ever solved and that most have stopped trying to solve. "Better than the 2000 finals?" Barkley asked. "The 2000 NBA Finals, Los Angeles Lakers versus Indiana Pacers. The first championship of the Shaq-Kobe three-peat. Game 6, June 19, 2000, Staples Center. Shaq, 41 points, 12 rebounds, a performance so dominant that it didn't just win the game, it redefined the concept of what a single human body could do to a basketball court. Finals MVP, the first of 3 consecutive. The beginning of a legacy that placed Shaquille O'Neal among the 10 greatest players in the history of the sport. Shaq thought about it for half a second. Better than everything, he said. Barkley squinted at him. The Barkley squint, a facial expression that communicates equal parts suspicion, affection, and competitive annoyance. "What did you do today?" Shaq smiled. The small smile, the real one. "I kept a promise," he said. The commercial break ended. The cameras came back on. The monitors flickered to life. Ernie welcomed the audience back. Kenny set up the next segment. Chuck made a joke about the Knicks. The show continued. And under the desk, where the cameras couldn't see, Shaq's hand was in his jacket pocket. Not holding the letter this time, the letter was framed now on a wall in Decatur, next to a drawing of a giant. His hand was empty. For the first time in 9 months, his hand was empty. Because the thing he'd been carrying, the letter, the question, the promise, the weight, was no longer his to carry. It had been delivered, it had been answered, it had been kept, the bell had rung 3 times. And somewhere in Atlanta, in a 2-bedroom apartment on Church Street with hardwood floors and a magnolia tree outside the kitchen window, an 8-year-old girl with a lucky pink beanie and a gray cat named Domingo was falling asleep in a bed that was hers, in a room that was hers, in a life that was hers. A life that existed because a giant stopped at a bench in 1997, and because a baby grew into a nurse, and because a nurse's daughter picked up a crayon and wrote 9 words to the biggest man on the TV basketball show. "Can you help my mom not cry anymore?" The answer was ringing. 3 times well, it's told to clearly say. There is a version of this story that is about money. A rich man pays a poor woman's bill. It is generous. It is kind. It makes for a good headline, the kind that trends for 6 hours on Twitter, gets shared 40,000 times on Facebook by people who type "faith in humanity restored" in the comments, generates a 3-minute segment on Good Morning America where the anchors smile with their whole faces and say, "What a beautiful story," before cutting to a commercial for laundry detergent. In that version, the story is consumed, digested, forgotten. It enters the bloodstream of the internet, provides a brief sugar rush of emotional warmth, and is metabolized and excreted within a single news cycle, replaced by the next story, the next headline, the next rich person doing a generous thing that makes the rest of us feel something for 30 seconds before we scroll. That version is not this story. This story is about circles, not metaphorical circles. Not the motivational poster kind of circles that life coaches draw on whiteboards and caption with words like karma and what goes around. Real circles. The kind that are drawn by human actions across human time, slowly, invisibly, without the knowledge or consent of the people who are drawing them. The kind that take 27 years to close. The kind that pass through 2 countries and 3 cities and 2 generations of women and 1 man who is 7 feet tall and who carries questions in his chest the way other people carry organs. In 1997, a 25-year-old man walked past a bench and made a choice. The choice cost him very little. A handful of cash, 2 minutes of his time, a business card he'd forgotten about by the following week. The cost was negligible. The consequence was infinite. Because the baby lived, and the baby grew up, and the baby became a nurse. And the nurse moved to Atlanta and worked nights and held other people's children, while they cried and inserted IVs and checked vitals and adjusted blankets and did the 10,000 thankless, invisible, essential tasks that keep sick children alive, while the world outside the hospital walls goes about its business of not thinking about sick children. And the nurse had a daughter. And the daughter got cancer, and the cancer generated bills, and the bills generated debt, and the debt generated despair, and the despair generated a letter, 9 words, green crayon, written by a child who believed that the rules are different when you are 7, and the letter traveled through the mail, through sorting facilities and delivery trucks, and the hands of postal workers who handle millions of pieces of correspondence every day, without knowing which ones contain the power to alter the trajectory of human lives. and arrived at a building in Atlanta where a woman in a mailroom opened it and felt a fist close around her heart and walked it to the right person instead of the wrong bin. And the right person walked it to the right room, and the man in the room read it. And the man put down his sandwich. And the man said 2 words, "Find her," and set in motion a chain of events that led, 6 weeks later, to a black card on a counter and 3 more words, "Put it on this," and a number that became 0 and a question that was finally answered. Did the baby live? The baby lived. The baby was standing in front of him, the circle closed. This is not a story about money. This is a story about what happens when a single act of kindness is allowed to travel, untracked, unfilmed, undocumented, unoptimized for engagement, across enough time to become something larger than itself, something that the person who performed it could not have predicted or imagined or intended, something that grew in the dark the way roots grow, silently, persistently in the direction of water. Shaquille O'Neal did not know, on that July afternoon in Newark, that he was planting a seed. He did not know that the cash he handed to Lucinda Constantino would fund a surgery that would save a baby that would grow into a woman, that would save other babies, that would raise a daughter, that would write a letter that would bring him back. He could not have known. The chain of causation was too long, too complex, too dependent on the independent choices of too many people. Lucinda's choice to go to the clinic, the surgeon's choice to operate, Maribel's choice to become a nurse, Pastor Dorothea's choice to open a shelter, Carolyn's choice to open an envelope, for any single mind to have predicted it. And yet it happened. It happened because of something that doesn't show up in probability models or data analyses or the actuarial tables that insurance companies use to calculate the monetary value of a human life. It happened because of a property of kindness that no economist has ever successfully quantified. Kindness compounds. Not the way money compounds. Predictably, mathematically, at a rate that can be expressed as a percentage and plotted on a graph. Kindness compounds chaotically, unpredictably, in directions that are invisible until you turn around, decades later, and see the shape that has formed behind you. The shape you were drawing all along without knowing you were drawing it. Shaq gave cash to a woman on a bench. The cash became a surgery. The surgery became a life. The life became a career. The career became a vocation. The vocation became a daughter. The daughter became a letter. The letter became a payment. The payment became a trust. The trust became an apartment, and a car, and a college fund, and a return to work, and a bell rung 3 times in a hallway with butterflies on the walls. Compound interest, on kindness, 27 years of it. This is what people miss when they share stories like this on social media with captions like, "Store your faith in humanity," and this is what it's all about. And the crying face emoji repeated 3 times. They reduce the story to its most shareable moment. The moment of the gift, the moment of the payment, the moment of the card on the counter, and they discard the rest. They discard the 27 years. They discard Lucinda's 3 jobs and Felicidad's 11 years of savings and Carolyn's granddaughter's cancers, and Clement's deaf cat and Dorothea's coffee cannon god financial philosophy and Dr. Nagarajan's 2 a.m. phone calls with her father in Chennai. They discard the architecture of human connection that made the moment possible, the scaffolding, the infrastructure, the load-bearing relationships that held the story up while it was being built. They see the cathedral. They don't see the foundation. And the foundation is the story. The foundation is always the story. Shaquille O'Neal has talked publicly in dozens of interviews across decades about his philosophy of giving. He has cited his mother, Lucille O'Neal, who raised 4 children on a military salary and who taught Shaq, by example rather than lecture, that generosity is not a function of wealth. It is a function of attention, of noticing, of the willingness to see a person who is hurting and to not look away. My mother told me that true wealth is measured by what you give, not what you have, Shaq has said. He has said it on podcasts. He has said it at charity events. He has said it so many times that it has become, in the public consciousness, a kind of slogan, the Shaq brand of generosity, neatly packaged, endlessly quotable, suitable for Instagram captions and motivational posters. but slogans are flat. They exist in two dimensions. They don't capture the texture of what generosity actually looks like when it is practiced over a lifetime. Not as a brand, not as a strategy, not as content, but as a discipline. A daily discipline. The discipline of paying attention to the people in front of you. The discipline of stopping when everything in your schedule tells you to keep walking. The discipline of handing over a card without knowing the number and saying 3 words without calculating the cost. The discipline of being big enough to carry something and humble enough to let it go. Shaq's lifetime of giving is well documented. The estimated $20 million in personal charitable contributions. The 1,000+ pairs of shoes purchased for children through Zappos partnerships. The furniture bought at Best Buy for families he met in the store. The tips, $4,000 to a waitress, $1,000 to a barista, amounts that would be irresponsible if they weren't so precisely calibrated to the emotional arithmetic of generosity. Enough to change a person's month, not so much that it changes the power dynamic between giver and receiver. The funerals paid for, the medical bills covered, the scholarships funded. The Shaquille O'Neal Foundation, which has donated over $4 million to children's charities, and which operates with a staff of 11 people and an overhead rate that would make most nonprofit boards weep with envy. But the number doesn't matter. The number has never mattered. What matters is the bench. What matters is that in 1997, before the 4 championships, before the Hall of Fame, before the $400 million business empire, before the doctorate and the television career and the endorsement deals and the statue outside what is now Crypto.com Arena, before all of it, a 25-year-old man saw a woman on a bench and stopped. He didn't stop because he was Shaquille O'Neal. He stopped because Lucille O'Neal raised him to stop. Because Philip Harrison trained him to notice. Because the Boys and Girls Club on South Orange Avenue taught him that every person you encounter is carrying something you can't see, and that the minimum human obligation, the bare, non-negotiable, entry-level requirement for being a person, is to care. He stopped. He asked, he gave, he walked away, and the giving traveled. For 27 years it traveled. Through Lucinda's hands to a surgeon's hands to a baby's healing liver. Through a coffee can on a refrigerator to an airplane ticket to a nursing school classroom to a hospital floor. Through a 7-year-old's crayon to a 61-year-old's mailroom to a dressing room where a meatball sub went cold. Through a pastor's yellow house to a billing office to a black card to a bell. 27 years, one act of kindness. Compounding. This is what the story is about. Not the money, not the celebrity, not the card. The stopping. The willingness to stop. In a world that is engineered for forward motion, for productivity, for efficiency, for the relentless optimization of time into output, the willingness to stop is the most radical act a person can perform. To stop walking, to stop scrolling, to stop calculating whether the person in front of you deserves your attention or your resources or your time. To simply stop and say, with your body and your presence and your attention, I see you, I'm here. What do you need? Shaq stopped at a bench in 1997, and the world rearranged itself around that stopping. Not immediately, not dramatically. Slowly, over 27 years. The way tectonic plates rearrange continents. Imperceptibly, inevitably, until one day you look at the map and realize that the land is in a different place than where it started. 100 million Americans carry medical debt. That number comes from the Kaiser Family Foundation, whose 2022 survey, the most comprehensive study of medical debt in the United States to date, found that approximately 100 million people in this country owe money for health care they or their family members have received. 100 million. Roughly 1 in 3 Americans. The number includes people with insurance and people without. People with jobs and people without. People who did everything right, who worked hard, who saved money, who played by the rules, who contributed to the system that was supposed to protect them, and who were crushed anyway, because the system was not designed to protect them. It was designed to process them. Nearly 1 in 4 families with children, 23%, according to the same survey, report that medical costs have caused significant financial hardship. Hardship that manifests as missed rent payments, skipped meals, depleted savings, maxed out credit cards, borrowed money from family members who can't afford to lend it, and the slow, grinding, daily math of trying to keep a family alive when the cost of keeping one member alive has consumed everything. Medical debt is the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in the United States. A 2019 study published in the American Journal of Public Health found that approximately 530,000 families file for bankruptcy each year due to medical bills and illness. 530,000. Every year. In the richest country in the history of human civilization. Maribel Constantino Reyes was not a statistic. She was a nurse, a mother, a daughter, a woman who came to this country on a nursing visa and spent 15 years caring for other people's children, and was crushed. Not by the disease, but by the bill for treating the disease. By the system she had given her career to serving. She was not a number. She was Maribel. She wore green scrubs. She held children at 3 a.m. She named her car after her grandmother. She made chicken nuggets for her daughter. 10-piece, sweet and sour, no exceptions. She prayed at St. Philip Benizi Catholic Church in Jonesboro when she could make it on Sundays, which was not often enough, and she carried her mother's gold earrings in a small box next to her bed, and she told Isa the story of the giant exactly once, the same way Lucinda had told it to her. On the night before Isa's first chemotherapy infusion, when Isa was scared and couldn't sleep and needed a story about a world where help comes from unexpected places, and giants stop at benches, and babies are saved, and everything, despite the evidence to the contrary, is going to be okay. She was saved twice by the same man. Some people call that coincidence. The word coincidence comes from the Latin coincidere, to fall together. Things that coincide are things that fall into the same place at the same time. The word implies randomness, accident, the absence of design. Some people call it fate. The word fate comes from the Latin fatum, that which has been spoken. Things that are fated are things that have been declared in advance by forces beyond human control. The word implies predetermination, inevitability, the absence of choice. Shaq doesn't call it either. When asked about it, privately, after the August visit to the hospital cafeteria, after the 2 hours of listening to Maribel's stories about Lucinda, after the tinola and the 3 jobs and the coffee can and the dialysis and the March morning when Lucinda died at 4:17 a.m. And the tree remembers what the axe forgets. Shaq said 6 words. I was just supposed to be there. He paused. Both times, I don't know why, I just was. Not coincidence, not fate, not karma or destiny or divine intervention or any of the words that human beings have invented to describe the feeling of being part of a pattern they didn't create and can't explain. Just supposed to be there. The simplest possible explanation. And the most honest, because Shaq is not a philosopher. He is not a theologian. He is not a man who spends his time constructing frameworks for understanding the architecture of the universe. He is a man who was very tall and very fast, and who used those attributes to become very successful, and who used that success to help people, and who, in the process of helping people, discovered something that success alone could never have taught him. That the most important moments of your life are not the ones you plan. They are the ones you stop for. Isadora Constantino Reyes is 9 years old now. She is in the 3rd grade at Westchester Elementary School in Decatur, Georgia. She is in Miss Hargrove's class. She reads at a 5th grade level, 2 grades ahead, which surprises no one who has ever met her, because Isa has been operating above her grade level since the day she picked up a green crayon and wrote a letter that navigated the United States Postal Service without a zip code and changed 2 lives. She wants to be a veterinarian, specifically a veterinarian for cats. This is a firm position. It has been a firm position since she was 6. Dogs are fine. She has nothing against dogs. She wants to be clear about that. She is not anti-dog. She simply believes that cats are superior in every measurable way, and that anyone who disagrees has not spent enough time with the right cat. Her evidence for this position is Domingo. Domingo is 12 years old now. His arthritis has worsened. He walks with a slight hitch in his back left leg, a rolling, uneven gait that makes him look, according to Isa, like a pirate. He has lost another tooth. He sleeps approximately 18 hours a day, which is not unusual for a cat his age, but which Isa monitors with clinical precision, recording his sleep and wake times in a small notebook that she keeps on her bedside table. A notebook that Dr. Nagarajan, during a follow-up appointment, noticed and said reminded her of a medical chart which pleased Isa enormously. Domingo is spoiled beyond comprehension. He eats a brand of wet food that costs $2.89 per can. A price point that Maribel initially resisted and eventually accepted, because arguing with Isel about Domingo's dietary needs is like arguing with the tide about its schedule. It will come in regardless of your objections. Domingo has a bed, a small circular fleece-lined bed that sits on the floor next to Isa's bed, but he does not use it. He sleeps on Isa's pillow, specifically on the left side of Isa's pillow. This arrangement means that Isa sleeps with her head tilted to the right, which is not ergonomically ideal, but which she considers a fair trade for the privilege of falling asleep to the sound of a 12-year-old cat breathing. He still doesn't purr for civilians, but he purrs for Isa, always, every night. A low, rattling, mechanical sound, more diesel engine than feline, that fills the small bedroom in the apartment on Church Street, and that is, for Isa, the sound of safety. The sound of home. The sound of a life that almost ended and didn't. Maribel still works the night shift at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. 11 p.m. to 11 a.m., the pediatric ICU. The same floor, the same nurse's station, the same hallway with the murals, the butterflies, the forests, the cat in the rocket ship. She still wears green scrubs. She still holds other people's children when they cry. She is, at this moment, on this specific day, in this specific year, in this specific version of reality that exists because a giant stopped at a bench in Newark in the summer of 1997, 40 years old. Her hair is longer than it was on Valentine's Day. She wears it down sometimes now. The bun is still her default for work. Practical, efficient, out of the way, but on her days off she lets it fall. Dark and straight, the way Lucinda's was, the way it was always supposed to be. She goes to Mass on Sundays. Most Sundays. St. Philip Benizi Catholic Church in Jonesboro. She sits in the fourth pew from the back, on the left side, near the stained glass window that depicts St. Philip Benizi himself, a 13th-century Italian saint known for his humility, his healing, and his refusal to accept the papacy when it was offered to him, a refusal that Maribel finds deeply relatable for reasons she has never fully articulated, but that have something to do with the Constantino Code and the concept of Hia and the bone-deep belief that the highest form of strength is the ability to not take what you haven't earned. She lights a candle for Lucinda every Sunday, a small white candle placed in the votive rack near the altar. She doesn't pray for Lucinda. Lucinda is beyond prayer now, in whatever place exists beyond the things we know. The place where mothers go when they have finished the work of being mothers. The place that Maribel imagines as a kitchen, with a linoleum floor and a pot of tinola on the stove and a coffee can on the refrigerator and the sound of jeepneys outside the window. She doesn't pray for Lucinda. She prays to her. Thank you, Nane. The giant came back. You were right. You were always right. And on the wall of the apartment, in Decatur, the apartment on Church Street, with the hardwood floors and the magnolia tree and the kitchen window that catches the November light. 2 frames hang side by side. The first frame holds a letter, written in green crayon on wide-ruled notebook paper, addressed to Mr. Shaq O'Neal, the biggest man on the TV basketball show. Postmarked December 28, 2023. Delivered without a zip code. Opened by a woman in a mailroom who felt a fist close around her heart. Read by a man in a dressing room who put down a meatball sub, carried in a jacket pocket for 6 weeks, carried for 27 years before that, in a different form, as a question, as a splinter, as the memory of a bench and a baby and a July afternoon that dissolved into the heat and never came back, until it came back, the letter that brought the giant back. The second frame holds a drawing, crayon on printer paper, 2 figures, one very tall, one very small, the tall one handing a black rectangle to the small one. The small one smiling, green crayon across the top. 4 words. The giant came back 2 frames, side by side. The call and the response. The question and the answer. The beginning and the continuation, not the end, because this story doesn't have an end. It has a trajectory, a direction, a line that started on a bench in Newark in 1997 and that passes through this apartment in Decatur in 2024, and that continues forward into a future where a 9-year-old girl grows up and becomes a veterinarian for cats and tells her own children, someday, about the time their grandmother wrote a letter to a giant, and the giant came, and those children will tell their children, and the story will travel, the way kindness travels, the way it has always traveled, not in straight lines, not on schedules, not through algorithms or platforms, or the optimized distribution channels of the attention economy. Through hands, through letters, through benches and bells and black cards and green crayons and the stubborn, irrational, magnificent human refusal to walk past someone who is hurting. Through stopping. Always through stopping. The bell rang 3 times on November 8, 2024, in a hallway with butterflies on the walls. It's toll to clearly say. But the ringing hasn't stopped. It's still going. Listen, you can hear it if you stop. That story right there is proof that one person stopping can change everything. One person paying attention. One person choosing not to walk past. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from right now. Whether you're in Atlanta or the Philippines or a small town nobody's ever heard of, let me know. I want to see how far this story travels. And if this video made you feel something, if it gave you chills, or put a lump in your throat, or made you believe that kindness still wins, hit that like button. Not for me, for Maribel. For every mom sitting in a billing office right now, holding a piece of paper with a number that's crushing her. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. You never know, you sharing this might be your bench moment, your moment to stop. Now click on the video on your screen right now, because the next story is just as powerful, and I promise you are not ready for it.